It begins with a question that is almost too dangerous to ask, a question that lingers at the edge of forbidden thought. What if the story of Jesus Christ, as told by centuries of church tradition, is incomplete? What if beneath the miracles, the parables, and the crucifixion lies a secret so disruptive, so world-shattering, that it could unravel the very foundations of organized Christianity? Imagine for a moment that Jesus was not only a spiritual teacher, not only the Son of God as doctrine claims, but also a husband, perhaps even a father. Imagine that his blood did not end on the cross, but continued to flow through generations, hidden in plain sight, protected, concealed, and pursued across centuries. This idea, Christ leaving behind a bloodline, has been treated as blasphemy, heresy, and conspiracy. Yet it is precisely because it has been so aggressively denied that the idea continues to haunt the imagination of those willing to peer into the shadows of history. For nearly 2,000 years, the official story has remained tightly controlled. The canonical Gospels, the four sanctioned accounts selected by the Church, offer little to suggest anything other than Christ's divine mission and celibate purity. But outside the approved texts lies a different current of tradition. Apocryphal writings, banned Gospels, and strange whispers in Gnostic teachings suggest a closer, more human dimension to Jesus, a man not untouched by love, not immune to family. These writings, deemed dangerous by church authorities, were locked away, burned, or branded as lies. Yet fragments survive, scattered across time, surfacing like half-buried ruins, daring us to piece them together. Why does the question of Christ's bloodline provoke such unease? The answer is simple: power. The Church has long claimed to be the earthly custodian of divine truth, its authority resting on the notion that Christ's mission ended with the resurrection and that spiritual salvation comes only through faith and the sacraments it controls. But if Jesus left behind a physical lineage, if his descendants lived on, then the power structure changes entirely. Authority would no longer belong solely to popes and priests. It might belong to flesh and blood heirs. The very concept of divine right, of apostolic succession, of the Church's supremacy, would collapse like a house of cards. Throughout history, even hints of this possibility have been treated with brutality. Those who dared to challenge the Church's narrative often paid with their lives. Heretics were silenced, burned, or excommunicated. Movements that placed Mary Magdalene in a position of special importance were crushed. And yet, despite centuries of suppression, the suspicion remains. It is there in medieval folklore, in cryptic symbols carved into cathedral walls, in whispered tales of exiled queens and hidden heirs. It resurfaces in Renaissance paintings, in coded manuscripts, in clandestine brotherhoods who claim to guard a truth the Church could not allow into the light. The question grows more unsettling when we realize that the idea of divine bloodlines is not unique to Christianity. Across cultures, sacred kingship has often been tied to family, to the passing of divine essence from one generation to another. Pharaohs of Egypt claimed descent from gods. European monarchs spoke of the divine right of kings, their authority justified by holy lineage. If such patterns existed everywhere else, why would the story of Jesus be the only exception? Why would his humanity, his role as a man embedded in family and community, be erased so completely? Unless, of course, the erasure itself was intentional. Consider the psychology of suppression. History has shown us that when institutions silence a narrative, it often signals not absurdity, but danger to authority. Galileo's telescope was denounced not because it failed to show the moons of Jupiter, but because it revealed too much truth for the Church to tolerate. So too with the possibility of Christ's bloodline. The harsher the denial, the more intriguing the possibility becomes. Why such fear? Why such violence against even the possibility of a Jesus who left descendants? What secret is so threatening that it must be buried under centuries of dogma and smoke? The forbidden question has been kept alive not only by scholars, but by ordinary believers and seekers who sense that the official version of history feels incomplete. They notice gaps in the gospel stories. They notice the strange way Mary Magdalene fades from the narrative after the resurrection, despite being described as the first witness to it. They wonder why the church, centuries later, deliberately recast her as a prostitute when no gospel makes such a claim. They wonder why female disciples were silenced, why alternative gospels celebrating Magdalene's closeness to Jesus were branded as heresy, and why so much energy was spent erasing her from collective memory. Could it be because acknowledging her importance would raise questions about her role as wife and mother? The danger of this idea lies not in its lack of evidence, but in its implications. If Jesus had a family, then the story of salvation changes from a singular sacrifice to a living continuum. His blood would not only symbolize redemption, it would flow through veins, through dynasties, through children and grandchildren. Salvation would not be mediated only through priests. It could be embodied in flesh and bone, in individuals walking among us, unaware of their legacy. The Grail itself, often imagined as a chalice, takes on new meaning when understood as the womb of Magdalene, the vessel of a sacred lineage. Suddenly, myth and metaphor collapse into human reality. From the deserts of Judea to the hills of southern France, from monasteries to secret societies, from dusty manuscripts to modern novels, this mystery has lingered like an echo that will not fade. The church may have tried to erase it, but erasure has the opposite effect. It creates intrigue. Each attempt to silence the question has only fueled its survival, passed along like a whisper that refuses to die. And today, in an age where hidden manuscripts resurface, where DNA can trace ancestry, where secrets cannot be so easily locked away, the question burns brighter than ever. Did Christ leave behind a bloodline? The weight of the question itself is part of its allure. It forces us to look at Jesus not only as a divine figure, but as a man, a human being with emotions, relationships, and perhaps obligations to those closest to him. It forces us to rethink what holiness means, not an abstract perfection untouched by earthly ties, but a sanctity that embraces the full human experience, including love, family, and continuity. It invites us to wonder whether the truest miracle is not only resurrection from death, but the persistence of blood across generations, a legacy that cannot be killed by nails or crosses. Yet for all its danger, the question offers something liberating as well. If Christ's blood flows in humanity, then divinity is closer than we think. It is not locked in heaven or in temples or in the hands of priests. It is within us, around us, walking through time. And perhaps this is why the story refuses to die, because it touches a truth that resonates too deeply to be silenced, a truth that makes the divine personal and intimate. This is where our journey begins, not with answers, but with a forbidden question, a question that has toppled empires of certainty, a question that has haunted monasteries and scholars, a question that flickers through art and legend like a coded message left by history itself. Did Jesus Christ, the man at the center of the world's most powerful religion, leave behind a bloodline? And if he did, who worked so hard to erase it? The shadows of history stretch wide, and as we step deeper into them, we will see that the closer we get to the answer, the more unsettling the silence becomes. If we're to search for traces of a hidden bloodline, we must first return to the origins, to the earliest sources where myth and history begin to blur. The official Gospels, selected by the Church centuries after Christ's death, tell a story of miracles, teachings, betrayal, and crucifixion. They portray Jesus as a divine figure whose mission transcends human ties, a man detached from earthly concerns. Yet even within these canonical texts, small fissures appear, moments that feel incomplete, interactions that hint at a deeper personal story left untold. It is within these silences, these carefully omitted details, that the seeds of a forbidden lineage may lie. The earliest Christians did not rely solely on the four Gospels we know today. Communities scattered across the Mediterranean preserved oral traditions, letters, and alternative accounts, each reflecting their own understanding of Jesus and his followers. Some of these accounts were eventually suppressed, declared heretical, and buried in deserts or hidden in caves, but they have survived in fragments. The Gospel of Philip, for instance, discovered among the Nag Hammadi texts in Egypt in 1945, contains cryptic passages that describe Mary Magdalene not simply as a follower, but as someone singled out for extraordinary closeness. In one controversial fragment, it speaks of Jesus loving her more than the other disciples, of kissing her often, which provoked jealousy among the men. Such language, though symbolic in places, cannot be ignored. It paints a picture of intimacy, of a relationship deeper than that of teacher and pupil, and one that carries the unmistakable undertone of partnership. Likewise, the Gospel of Mary, another banned text, gives Magdalene a voice silenced in the canon. She is depicted as a recipient of hidden teachings, entrusted with revelations that the male disciples fail to grasp. Peter himself, in these accounts, questions why Jesus would reveal so much to her, as though uncomfortable with the authority she holds. This tension between Magdalene's elevated role in some traditions and her marginalization in official scripture suggests more than theological disagreement. It suggests deliberate exclusion, a rewriting of the story to minimize her importance. If she was truly central, if she was not only a disciple, but perhaps a partner, even a wife, then removing her from prominence was essential for shaping a narrative where Christ's mission was purely spiritual, free of human entanglements. But it is not only in Gnostic texts that hints appear. Even in the canonical Gospels, small details slip through. At the crucifixion, when the male disciples have fled, it is the women who remain. Among them is Mary Magdalene, standing closest to the cross, the one who refuses to abandon him even in death. And it is she who is the first to witness the resurrection, a fact recorded in all four Gospels. Why her? Why grant her such a role in the most critical moment of the Christian story? Tradition tells us it is because of her faith, her devotion. But devotion alone does not explain the narrative weight given to her presence. It feels almost like a remnant of a larger story, a fragment left intact after much else was erased. The silence of the New Testament regarding Jesus' personal life is itself suspicious. In Jewish culture of the first century, marriage was not only common, but expected. Rabbis, particularly those who taught publicly, were almost always married, for to remain unmarried was unusual and often frowned upon. Jesus is consistently described as a teacher, a rabbi, one who drew crowds and taught in synagogues. If he were celibate, why is there no explicit mention of this radical choice? The Gospels are silent, not because celibacy was natural, but perhaps because a partnership was assumed, and mentioning it directly would later prove inconvenient for the story the Church wanted to tell. Outside the Gospels, whispers persist. Early Jewish polemics against Christianity, written in an attempt to discredit Jesus, accused him of illegitimacy, of questionable lineage. While these writings were hostile, their very existence highlights how lineage and family were central points of contention from the beginning. The emphasis on bloodline, whether to affirm or deny it, suggests that the earliest communities were deeply concerned with Jesus' place within family and society, and perhaps with the possibility that his influence extended beyond death through descendants. When we examine how early Christian writings were chosen and compiled into the New Testament, the picture becomes clearer. By the 4th century, under Constantine, the Church sought unity above all else. Dozens of Gospels circulated, some placing women in prominent roles, some hinting at teachings not easily controlled by hierarchy. The Council of Nicaea and other gatherings did not merely preserve the truth. They selected a version of truth that reinforced authority. Texts that emphasized a more human Jesus, texts that highlighted his closeness to Mary Magdalene, were pushed aside. What remained was a narrative stripped of human ties, focused solely on divinity, miracles, and sacrifice. But history resists neat closure. The discovery of texts like those at Nag Hammadi reopens questions long buried. Why were these writings hidden away, carefully stored in jars and buried in the desert? Perhaps because their authors knew the danger of keeping them public. These texts challenge the sterile, celibate image of Jesus and suggest a dimension that blends the human with the divine. They speak of secret knowledge, private relationships, and truths that the institutional church would later deem intolerable. The roots of the mystery, then, are not simply in folklore or medieval legend, but in the very soil of Christianity itself. From the beginning, there were competing versions of the story, competing visions of who Jesus was and what his mission meant. One vision triumphed, supported by empire and authority. The other was driven underground, erased, burned, or forgotten. Yet fragments survive, enough to raise unsettling questions. Could it be that what was branded as heresy was, in fact, a closer reflection of reality? Could it be that behind the spiritual Christ was also a husband, a partner, perhaps a father? Such questions have no easy answers, but their persistence is telling. For if the possibility of a bloodline were absurd, it would not need suppression. It would fade on its own. Instead, the early church reacted with ferocity, silencing gospels, redefining Mary Magdalene, and erasing every trace that might suggest intimacy or family. The very intensity of this erasure is what keeps the suspicion alive. It is as though history itself has left behind a ghostly outline, an absence that speaks louder than presence, a gap in the story that demands explanation. The roots of this mystery lie at the intersection of silence and survival. The silence of the canonical texts regarding Jesus' personal life, the survival of banned writings that tell a different story, the contradictions between what was preserved and what was erased. These together form the foundation of a forbidden history. From these roots, legends will grow, myths will spread, and dynasties will claim descent. But it all begins here, in the earliest Gospels, where the story of Christ is not one tale, but many, and where the possibility of a bloodline is planted like a seed waiting to resurface centuries later. Mary Magdalene has always occupied a strange and controversial place in the Christian imagination. To some, she is the penitent sinner, the fallen woman redeemed by Christ's forgiveness, forever kneeling in shadows with tears on her face. To others, she is the most faithful disciple, the first to witness the resurrection, the one whose devotion surpassed that of all the apostles. Yet behind these conflicting portraits lies a deeper question. Who was she really, and why did the Church go to such extraordinary lengths to redefine her identity? If we are to explore the possibility of a bloodline, it is impossible to avoid her, for in every strand of evidence, in every whisper of hidden tradition, Mary Magdalene stands at the center. The Gospels tell us little about her origins. She appears suddenly in the story, a woman from Magdala, a town on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. She is said to have been healed by Jesus, freed of 7 demons, a phrase whose meaning scholars still debate. Was it literal possession, mental illness, or a symbolic way of describing deep transformation? Whatever it was, after this encounter, she never left his side. She traveled with him, supported his ministry, and was named repeatedly among the women who followed him all the way to Jerusalem. In the canonical accounts, she is present at the crucifixion, present at the burial, and the first at the tomb on the morning of the resurrection. These are not minor details. To be given such prominence in all 4 Gospels suggests she was far more significant than tradition later allowed. Yet centuries later, the image of Magdalene changes drastically. In 591 CE, Pope Gregory the Great delivered a sermon that forever altered her reputation. He conflated Mary Magdalene with the unnamed sinful woman who anoints Jesus' feet in Luke's Gospel, and with Mary of Bethany, sister of Lazarus. With this interpretation, Magdalene became the repentant prostitute, a woman defined not by discipleship, but by sin and forgiveness. This portrayal, though never supported by Scripture itself, took hold with remarkable force. For more than 1,000 years, Magdalene was remembered primarily as the fallen woman redeemed by Christ's mercy. The Church exalted her not as a leader or partner, but as a symbol of repentance, a warning to women of the dangers of desire, and a reassurance of Christ's ability to cleanse even the most impure. But why such a drastic recasting? Why take a woman consistently depicted as close to Jesus and transform her into a repentant harlot? The answer seems less theological than political. The early church, dominated by male leadership, struggled with female voices in positions of authority. The apocryphal Gospels, discovered centuries later, repeatedly portray Magdalene as a figure of wisdom, a recipient of secret teachings, someone whose authority was contested by Peter himself. In the Gospel of Mary, Peter challenges her. Did he really speak these things to you, or are you inventing them? The tension is palpable. Magdalene is not a sinner in these accounts, but a leader, a rival to Peter's authority. For the institutional church, built on apostolic succession from Peter, the simplest way to neutralize her was to rewrite her role, recasting her not as a leader, but as a cautionary tale. This deliberate act of suppression becomes even more suspicious when one considers her constant presence in pivotal moments. When all others fled, she remained at the crucifixion. When Joseph of Arimathea laid Jesus in the tomb, she was there. When dawn broke 3 days later, it was she who found the stone rolled away. The risen Christ appears to her first, and he entrusts her with the task of telling the disciples, a moment so significant that theologians later refer to her as the apostle to the apostles. If she held this position of honor, why was she reduced to the role of sinner? Why was her voice muted? Unless, of course, acknowledging her full importance risked revealing a truth the Church could not allow, that she may not have been simply a disciple, but something far closer. Consider the cultural context. For a Jewish teacher in the 1st century, marriage was the norm, not the exception. A rabbi was expected to marry, for family life was central to Jewish identity and law. The absence of any mention of Jesus' marital status is striking, and silence is often the loudest clue. If Jesus had been unmarried, an unusual choice for his time, one might expect the Gospels to comment on it. Instead, they say nothing. And in that silence, Magdalene's role looms larger. Her constant companionship, her unique authority, her portrayal in banned texts as beloved, all of it hints at a bond deeper than the Church was willing to admit. Later traditions, particularly those emerging in France, claim that Magdalene fled after the crucifixion, carrying not only teachings but something far more precious. Legends speak of her arriving on the shores of Provence with a small group, perhaps even with a child. She is venerated there not as a sinner, but as a saint, her presence woven into the fabric of local folklore and sacred geography. Medieval art often depicts her not with shame, but with a chalice, a symbol tied to the Holy Grail, reinforcing the suggestion that she carried something vital, something sacred, something meant to be protected. The Magdalene who emerges from these shadows is not the broken penitent of church tradition, but a woman of authority, intimacy, and possibly motherhood. In Renaissance paintings, coded symbolism often elevates her beyond mere disciple. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci, steeped in esoteric traditions, depicted her in ways that hinted at hidden knowledge. Some art historians argue that the figure seated beside Christ in the Last Supper, often assumed to be John, bears feminine features, possibly Magdalene herself. Whether intentional or not, such imagery has fueled speculation that she was more than just a follower, that she was his partner, perhaps even his wife. The implications are staggering. If Magdalene was Christ's wife, then the story of Christianity changes fundamentally. No longer is Jesus a solitary figure detached from human ties. He becomes a man who embraced both divine mission and human love. If she was his wife, the possibility of children cannot be ignored. And if children existed, then a bloodline flows through history, one that the Church would have every reason to conceal. For if Christ's authority could be inherited, if divine legitimacy flowed not through popes, but through descendants, the entire edifice of ecclesiastical power would be threatened. And so, Magdalene's story was rewritten. Her voice was silenced, her image tarnished, her legacy confined to penance and sin. But beneath that layer of distortion, the echoes of her true role remain. They surface in apocryphal texts, in folk traditions, in symbols carved into stone and painted on canvas. They whisper of a partnership erased, a woman who may have carried within her the future of Christ's bloodline. Mary Magdalene remains one of history's great enigmas. Was she a repentant sinner, or was she the keeper of Christ's most intimate secret? Was she simply a disciple, or was she his partner, his wife, the mother of a lineage that would ripple across centuries? The contradictions in her portrayal reveal as much as the texts themselves. The Church's eagerness to redefine her, the persistence of legends surrounding her, and the recurring appearance of her image in hidden corners of history all point to a truth too dangerous to be admitted openly. As we move deeper into this story, her figure will not disappear. On the contrary, she will become more central, more inescapable. For if the forbidden bloodline exists, it begins with her. She is the vessel, the silent partner, the erased queen of Christianity whose shadow still falls across the corridors of time. And no matter how many sermons painted her as a prostitute, no matter how many centuries sought to bury her true role, the question endures. Was Mary Magdalene not the sinner the Church described, but the mother of a sacred bloodline it sought to erase? After the crucifixion, Jerusalem was not a safe place for those closest to Jesus. The Roman authorities had made their point with brutal efficiency. Rebels, prophets, and would-be messiahs would meet the cross. For the disciples, fear was immediate and overwhelming. Many fled into hiding, some returned to Galilee, and others scattered beyond the borders of Judea. But what of Mary Magdalene? What of the women who remained at the foot of the cross, those who had not abandoned him even in the moment of death? For centuries, legends whispered of a journey, an escape from the hostility of Jerusalem to the distant shores of Gaul, a place far removed from Roman persecution, where the memory of Jesus might be preserved in safety. The story begins with fragments of folklore carried through oral tradition. Medieval accounts describe how, after the crucifixion, a small group fled the Holy Land by sea. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary Salome, Martha, and Joseph of Arimathea. Some versions claim that they were cast adrift in a rudderless boat, left to the mercy of the sea, a symbolic exile meant to erase them. Others suggest they were guided by hidden allies, perhaps wealthy patrons sympathetic to their cause, who ensured their safe passage across the Mediterranean. Either way, the legends converge on one destination, the coast of southern France, near what is now Provence. In the small French town of Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer, a centuries-old tradition commemorates the arrival of these exiles. Each year, pilgrims gather to celebrate the coming of the three Marys who, according to local lore, stepped ashore there. Statues of Mary Magdalene and her companions are carried through the streets, a ritual that preserves memory where historical records fall silent. To many, these are merely pious legends, stories embroidered by medieval imagination. But to others, they are echoes of something much older, hints of a journey made in desperation, a journey that carried with it the seeds of a hidden lineage. The most striking aspect of the French tradition is how it elevates Magdalene not as a penitent sinner, but as a saint, a preacher, and a bearer of truth. In the region of Provence, she is said to have lived for years in a cave near Saint-Baume, devoting herself to prayer and teaching. Pilgrims for centuries have climbed the rocky path to her grotto, treating it as sacred ground. Unlike the Church's portrayal of her as the repentant prostitute, the French tradition remembers her as something much greater, a holy figure who carried with her the deepest mysteries of Christ's message. Why would local tradition honor her so fervently, if she were nothing more than the forgiven sinner of Rome's sermons? Perhaps because the people of Gaul preserved a different memory, one closer to the truth. Here the legends begin to deepen. merging into something far more provocative. Some accounts claim that Magdalene did not come alone, but that she brought with her a child. In certain versions, the child was her daughter, born from her union with Jesus. This child, according to lore, would grow to be the ancestor of noble families in France, intertwining with the destiny of European royalty. Though the mainstream church dismissed such stories as fanciful, they persisted in local folklore, passed along by troubadours, monks, and mystics who spoke of a hidden bloodline surviving in the valleys and castles of the south. Joseph of Arimathea also plays a mysterious role in these tales. Known in the Gospels as the man who offered his tomb for Jesus' burial, Joseph later becomes a central figure in Grail lore. In British tradition, he journeys to Glastonbury, bringing with him relics of Christ, perhaps even the Grail itself. In the French versions, he is linked to the protection of Magdalene and her companions, as though he were part of a secret network of guardians ensuring their survival. Whether these are myths or encoded history, the recurring theme is unmistakable. After the crucifixion, those closest to Jesus carried something precious across the sea, something worth protecting at all costs. Skeptics argue that these stories are medieval inventions, pious fictions created to attract pilgrims and enhance the prestige of local churches. And yet, when examined closely, the persistence and consistency of the legends suggest something more. Across southern France, multiple sites claim association with Magdalene. Her cave at Saint-Baume, her relics at Saint-Maximin-la-Saint-Baume, her arrival celebrated at Saint Mary's de la Mer. Why so many? Why did devotion to her concentrate so strongly in this region? Could it be that the people of Gaul preserved fragments of a tradition the Church sought to erase elsewhere? There's also the curious matter of symbolism. In French art and folklore, Magdalene is often depicted not as degraded, but as radiant, sometimes shown with a chalice, sometimes with long flowing hair, symbolizing both power and fertility. The chalice, of course, resonates with Grail imagery. If the Grail is not merely a cup but a vessel of blood, then Magdalene herself, and perhaps the child she carried, becomes the Grail incarnate. Suddenly, the migration to Gaul takes on deeper meaning. It is not only an exile, but a transfer of the most sacred relic of all, a living bloodline. From Provence, the story continues in strange ways. Noble families in the region, particularly the Merovingians, centuries later, claimed descent from a divine source. Their symbols often included bees, fleurs de lis, and mystical imagery linked to sacred kingship. While historians dismiss much of this as political propaganda, others argue that these dynasties drew upon real traditions preserved since Magdalene's time. They were not inventing a lineage, they were recalling one. If Magdalene did indeed journey to Gaul, it would explain much about the Church's later efforts to suppress her. Elevating Peter and Paul, while diminishing her, was not only about gender roles or authority. It was about control of a secret that could destabilize everything. If her presence in France became widely accepted, if the stories of her child spread too far, then the claim of a Christ bloodline would no longer be rumor, but history. And so, the Church tolerated pilgrimages to her cave, celebrated her feast day, and accepted her as a saint, but only within the boundaries of its own narrative, the sinner redeemed, not the partner who carried forward a sacred family. The story of Magdalene's flight to Gaul has never faded. It lingers in festivals, in place names, in relics venerated in cathedrals, in the devotion of the people of Provence. Whether historical or legendary, it testifies to something powerful. The idea that Christ's legacy did not end in Jerusalem but traveled across the sea, hidden within the life of a woman the Church worked so hard to silence. And if she did indeed arrive on those French shores with a child, then the blood of Christ has flowed quietly through European history ever since, shaping dynasties in ways the Church could never fully control. The legends of Mary Magdalene's journey to Gaul would be little more than quaint folklore, if not for the strange and persistent thread that surfaces centuries later in the history of France: the rise of the Merovingian dynasty. Emerging in the 5th century, these so-called long-haired kings, carved out a realm that would eventually become the foundation for what we recognize as medieval France. But what set them apart, what gave them a mystique unlike any other dynasty, was not just their military power or political cunning. It was the aura of sacredness that clung to their bloodline, an aura that many whispered had roots far older than Rome, older even than the Franks themselves. The story begins with a shadowy figure known as Merovech, the semi-mythical founder of the Merovingian line. His origins are steeped in legend. Chronicles claim that his mother was impregnated while swimming in the sea, visited by a strange, otherworldly creature, half man, half beast. From this union, Merovech was born, giving the dynasty its name. On the surface, this is a fantastical myth, the kind that medieval chroniclers often invented to glorify their rulers. But beneath the strangeness lies something symbolic. A bloodline set apart, touched by the divine or supernatural, marked from the very beginning as different. The Merovingians were obsessed with their own distinction. Unlike later kings who crowned themselves with Roman-style pomp, the Merovingian rulers emphasized their long, uncut hair as a symbol of their sacred status. They considered themselves priest-kings, mediators between heaven and earth. Their subjects treated them not merely as rulers, but as semi-divine figures whose blood carried power. The church tolerated them, at least at first, but always with a cautious distance. For the church sought to place itself as the sole intermediary between God and man, while the Merovingians presented a rival source of spiritual legitimacy rooted not in papal authority, but in their very veins. This aura of holiness surrounding the dynasty has led some to speculate that the Merovingians were not just another Germanic royal house, but something else entirely. What if their claim to sacred blood was not empty myth-making? What if it was the coded survival of an older tradition, the bloodline carried by Magdalene from Judea to the shores of Gaul? Could the dynasty's sense of destiny be rooted in knowledge that their lineage connected them to Christ himself? Such an idea may seem outrageous, yet the symbolism aligns in uncanny ways. The legend of Magdalene arriving in Provence places her directly in southern France, precisely where the Merovingians later established their early strongholds. The myth of Merovech's supernatural conception parallels the idea of a bloodline touched by something beyond the ordinary, a way of encoding divine descent in mythological form. And the Merovingian emphasis on sacred kingship resonates strongly with Jewish messianic traditions, in which kingship and bloodline were inseparable. Medieval sources also record the peculiar behavior of Merovingian kings after death. Unlike others, they were often buried with elaborate relics, strange B-shaped ornaments, and treasures symbolizing renewal and immortality. Bees, in particular, became their emblem, a symbol of resurrection and eternal life. Napoleon himself, centuries later, would adopt the bee as his personal emblem, linking his empire to the memory of these ancient kings. But bees also carry another resonance. They're a symbol of the feminine, of the womb, of fertility and sacred continuity. For those who read the symbols closely, the bee suggests more than just royalty. It suggests lineage, the carrying forward of something holy from generation to generation. If indeed the Merovingians were heirs to a hidden bloodline, the church would have had every reason to diminish them. A dynasty claiming direct descent from Christ, or even from his family, would undermine the very foundations of papal authority. For if kings could claim spiritual legitimacy from their blood alone, the church's role as gatekeeper of divine power would collapse. And so history records a strange shift. The Merovingians, once powerful, were gradually weakened, manipulated, and ultimately replaced. By the 8th century, the papacy had turned its favor toward the Carolingians, most famously Charlemagne, while the Merovingians were reduced to figureheads, do-nothing kings, as the chronicles mockingly called them. It was not simply politics. It was erasure. The erasure, however, was never complete. Whispers persisted, carried in monastic archives, troubadour songs, and secretive brotherhoods. Some noble families quietly trace their ancestry back to the Merovingians, preserving genealogies as though safeguarding a truth too dangerous to proclaim openly. In certain circles, this descent was not just a matter of pride. It was a mark of sacred duty, protectors of a legacy that could never be allowed to die. This is where the narrative takes on an esoteric dimension. The Merovingians were not remembered merely as rulers. They became woven into Grail lore itself. By the time the legends of the Holy Grail began to circulate in the 12th century, stories of a bloodline hidden in France had already been circulating in folk tradition. Some scholars argue that the Grail was never a cup at all, but a symbol for sang-real, royal blood. According to this interpretation, the Merovingians were the living Grail, the vessel that carried Christ's blood into the future. Suddenly, Magdalene's flight, the stories of her child, and the rise of this strange dynasty all connect into a single, staggering possibility. Skeptics, of course, dismiss these links as medieval myth-making conspiracy theories projected backward. They argue that the Merovingians were simply another Germanic dynasty, that their symbols were pagan leftovers, that the Magdalene traditions in France were nothing more than local legends spun into grandeur by later generations. But such dismissals often ignore the persistence of these traditions across centuries and the way they dovetail into each other with remarkable precision. Independent strands of folklore, symbolism, and recorded history seem to weave together into a tapestry that is difficult to explain away as coincidence. One particularly intriguing aspect is the way the Merovingian mythos survived in secret societies. During the Middle Ages and beyond, groups like the Knights Templar, later the Rosicrucians, and eventually modern esoteric orders like the Priory of Sion all claimed some connection to the preservation of a sacred bloodline. The Merovingians are always at the center of these claims. Why? If their legacy were merely another forgotten dynasty, why would they remain so central to esoteric traditions for over 1,000 years? Perhaps because these societies held fragments of the truth, that the Merovingians were indeed the descendants of Christ and Magdalene, protectors of the bloodline that had been smuggled into France under threat of annihilation. As centuries passed, this idea became so dangerous that it was wrapped in layers of allegory and secrecy. To speak openly of a Christ bloodline would invite immediate condemnation as heresy. But to sing of a Grail quest, of a hidden vessel, of a wounded king whose land could be healed only by the restoration of rightful blood, that was safe. It was myth to the masses, but truth to the initiates. And at the heart of it all lay the Merovingians, the dynasty erased from power, but immortalized in legend. Thus, the Merovingians were never entirely forgotten. Their story remained encoded in folklore, in symbols, in secret genealogies, and esoteric texts. They became both a memory and a warning, that there existed a bloodline the Church could not control, one that, if revealed, could topple the edifice of papal supremacy. For if Christ's legacy lived not in Rome, but in the veins of a hidden family, then the entire architecture of Christian authority was built on unstable ground. The story of the Merovingians is not merely the history of a dynasty. It is the story of suppression, survival, and the enduring power of lineage. Their rise and fall illustrate how dangerous blood can be. Blood that carries with it not just royal legitimacy, but divine resonance. And though they were dethroned, though their memory was obscured, the whispers never ceased. In the shadows of castles and abbeys, in the songs of troubadours, and in the coded allegories of Grail legends, the Merovingian name endured, carrying with it the possibility that within their veins flowed the most forbidden blood of all. By the time the Merovingians had been erased from the visible stage of power, their legacy did not disappear. Instead, it slipped underground, carried in silence by those who believed themselves guardians of something far greater than political dominion. If there was indeed a bloodline descending from Christ through Mary Magdalene, if it had intertwined with the Merovingians, then its survival into the medieval world would have required careful, deliberate protection. This is where the story of the Knights Templar enters, a chapter that has fascinated historians, mystics, and conspiracy theorists for centuries. The official narrative of the Templars is already drenched in mystery. Formed in 1119, in the aftermath of the First Crusade, they began as a small band of knights pledged to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. 9 men, led by Hugues de Payens, took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, dedicating themselves to both martial defense and religious devotion. They were given quarters on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, hence their name, the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon. But the circumstances of their rise invite deeper questions. Why were 9 knights, with no real resources or army, granted such a privileged position at the heart of the most contested city in Christendom? Why were they allowed to set up camp in the ruins of Solomon's Temple, a site brimming with biblical and esoteric significance? For nearly a decade, the Templars did not fulfill the role of military protectors in any meaningful sense. Instead, they conducted something far more enigmatic: excavations beneath the Temple Mount. Rumors circulated that they were searching for relics, secret texts, or hidden treasures buried during the fall of Jerusalem centuries earlier. Some claimed they discovered the Ark of the Covenant. Others suggested ancient scrolls, perhaps records of Christ's bloodline, survived there, placed in hiding by early followers who feared Roman destruction. Whatever they found, their order's fortunes changed dramatically after this mysterious period of silence. Within a generation, the Templars transformed into one of the most powerful institutions in medieval Europe. They amassed vast estates, controlled banking systems, built castles, and commanded armies that rivaled kings. Their influence spread across Christendom, and they operated with remarkable autonomy, answerable only to the Pope. How did such an unprecedented rise occur? The simplest answer is that they held something, knowledge, relic, or secret, that made both kings and popes wary of opposing them. Among the theories surrounding the Templars, the idea that they became guardians of Christ's bloodline is one of the most provocative. If the Merovingians represented that lineage, and if their legacy had been suppressed, then it would make sense that an order loyal to neither king nor bishop, but to their own inner oath, might take on the role of protectors. Their secrecy, their coded rituals, and their enigmatic symbols suggest that their mission extended beyond mere defense of pilgrims. They guarded something sacred, something dangerous, something that had to survive across centuries. Their connection to France is also telling. The Templars' strongest bases of support lay not in Jerusalem or Rome, but in France. Many of their Grand Masters were French. Their estates flourished in the Languedoc and Provence, the very regions where Magdalene's legend was strongest and where the Merovingian dynasty had once held sway. This geographic overlap is too striking to dismiss. Were the Templars not simply warriors, but custodians of the legacy seated in those lands 1,000 years earlier? The Grail legends, which blossomed in the same period, only deepened the connection. Chrétien de Troyes, writing in the late 12th century, was the first to pen a story of a mysterious vessel known as the Grail. Soon after, other poets expanded the tale, weaving it into a tapestry of quests, wounded kings, and hidden treasures. But here lies the crucial detail. Many of these authors were linked to the same regions where Templar and Magdalene traditions thrived. The Grail stories emerged in the cultural soil of Languedoc, precisely where heretical sects like the Cathars also spoke of a truer Christianity, one that bypassed the authority of Rome. Some researchers argue that the Grail legends are allegories for the very secret the Templars guarded, the survival of Christ's bloodline. The Grail is not a chalice, but a womb, not a vessel of stone or gold, but of flesh and blood. The lineage carried through Magdalene, preserved through the Merovingians, and watched over by those sworn to secrecy. The Templars, in this reading, were the Grail Knights not by metaphor, but by literal duty. Their quest was not to find the Grail, but to protect it from annihilation. The Cathars offer another intriguing link. In the early 13th century, The Cathar movement flourished in the very heartland of Languedoc. They rejected the authority of the Catholic Church, preached a dualistic spirituality, and claimed to preserve teachings closer to the original message of Christ. The Church responded with brutality, launching the Albigensian Crusade to exterminate them. Entire towns were slaughtered, villages burned, tens of thousands massacred under the rallying cry, "Kill them all. God will know his own." Yet in the ashes of this genocide, whispers remained that the Cathars had safeguarded something, an artifact or a truth that the Church desperately wanted destroyed. Some suggest that the Cathars, like the Templars, were tied to the Magdalene tradition, that they preserved knowledge of the bloodline, hidden in their mountain fortresses like Montségur, which became the last stand of their movement. When Montségur fell in 1244, legends say a small group escaped with a great treasure, one not of gold, but of sacred significance. Could it have been the genealogical records of the bloodline? Could it have been the very child of the Magdalene encoded into symbols, relics, or secret texts? The parallels between Cathar lore, Templar power, and Grail myth are too intertwined to dismiss as coincidence. The Templars themselves eventually met the same fate as the Cathars. By the early 14th century, their wealth and independence had made them a target. King Philip IV of France, deeply in debt to the order, orchestrated their downfall with papal complicity. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, the Templars were arrested en masse. Charged with heresy, blasphemy, and secret rites, they were tortured into confessions and burned at the stake. Yet, even in destruction, mystery surrounded them. Many of their fleets vanished. Their treasuries could not be accounted for, and their secrets, if they truly guarded something as profound as the bloodline, were never revealed. What is remarkable is how their legend endured. Across Europe, whispers spread that the Templars had not been annihilated, only driven underground, that they survived in hidden brotherhoods, later emerging in disguised forms, such as the Freemasons or other secret societies, that their guardianship of the bloodline continued in silence, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. To this day, the Templars remain a symbol of mystery, guardianship, and forbidden knowledge. If we accept the possibility that the Templars were linked to the protection of Christ's descendants, then their suppression takes on new meaning. It was not simply about greed or power, but about silencing those who carried a truth too destabilizing for Christendom. The Church could tolerate kings who fought wars, nobles who rebelled, even heretics who challenged doctrine, but could not tolerate the survival of a bloodline that, if revealed, would expose Rome's greatest fraud. That spiritual authority lay not in papal decrees, but in living descendants who bore Christ's own blood. And so the Templars were destroyed, or at least made to disappear from history. Yet their shadow never faded. In symbols carved into cathedrals, in the myths of hidden treasure, in the lore of secret societies, their presence lingers. Perhaps because they were never merely knights. They were guardians of the greatest secret of all, the one truth that could shatter the world. The forbidden bloodline of Christ, carried from Magdalene to Merovingian, and hidden across centuries by warriors who swore their lives to its survival. By the time the Knights Templar were rising to power in Europe, another movement was already flourishing in the very heartland where Magdalene's traditions were strongest, the Cathars of Languedoc. To most chroniclers of the Catholic Church, they were heretics, dangerous duelists who rejected the sacraments and undermined papal authority. But to the people of southern France, they were something far more profound. Spiritual leaders who offered an alternative Christianity, one stripped of Rome's corruption and closer, perhaps, to the original message of Christ. Their presence, their teachings, and their sudden annihilation would become one of the bloodiest chapters in medieval history, and one of the most mysterious. The Cathars were not a small sect hiding in shadows. By the late 12th century, their movement had spread across the Languedoc region, attracting nobles, peasants, and even knights. They called themselves the good Christians or the perfects. Their faith was ascetic, emphasizing purity, simplicity, and rejection of worldly excess. They denied the authority of Rome, dismissed the need for elaborate cathedrals, and rejected the Church's sacraments. To them, baptism was not a ritual of water, but a spiritual transformation. The Eucharist was symbolic, not literal. They refused the Church's hierarchy of priests and bishops, teaching instead that divine truth could be accessed directly through personal purity and knowledge. To the papacy, such beliefs were intolerable. Not merely heresy, but rebellion. The Church had grown fat with wealth, indulgences, and temporal power. The Cathars threatened to expose it all by living simply, by preaching a gospel that made Rome irrelevant. Yet what is most intriguing is how their beliefs aligned with strands of hidden lore connected to Magdalene. In Languedoc, the Cathars revered Mary Magdalene not as a sinner, but as a saint and spiritual teacher. In some accounts, they saw her as the true inheritor of Christ's message, a figure sidelined by the apostles but never forgotten. This devotion resonated with the local traditions of Provence, where legends placed Magdalene's exile and her cave of meditation. It is here that speculation deepens. Were the Cathars merely reformers, or were they keepers of a much older secret? Some historians argue that the Cathars possessed knowledge or texts that directly challenged Rome's narrative of Christ. Perhaps they preserved writings from early Gnostic traditions, which emphasized secret teachings given to Magdalene. Perhaps they held genealogical records of a bloodline descended from Christ himself. Whatever the truth, the Catholic Church moved with ferocity, determined to obliterate them. In 1209, Pope Innocent III launched what became known as the Albigensian Crusade. Unlike the earlier crusades against Muslims in the Holy Land, this one was directed inward, against fellow Christians. Armies of northern French nobles descended upon Languedoc, and what followed was not just war, it was slaughter. Whole towns were burned. Men, women, and children were massacred indiscriminately. At Béziers, when asked how to distinguish heretics from faithful Catholics, the papal legate reportedly gave the infamous reply, "Kill them all. God will know his own." Tens of thousands perished in fire and sword. And yet, despite this brutality, the Cathars held on, retreating into strongholds high in the mountains. Their most famous refuge was Montségur, a fortress perched on a steep peak in the Pyrenees. From its walls, the Cathars resisted for years, sheltering their leaders, their perfects, and, if the legends are true, their greatest treasures. Montségur became more than a fortress. It became a symbol, the last beacon of an alternative Christianity, the final stand of those who claimed to preserve a truth Rome wanted erased forever. In March 1244, Montségur fell. Surrounded by Crusader armies, the defenders surrendered. Over 200 Cathars refused to renounce their faith. They were marched down the mountain and burned alive in a vast bonfire, singing hymns as flames consumed them. But here is where the story takes its mysterious turn. Just before the fall of Montségur, according to several accounts, a small group of Cathars lowered themselves down the cliffs under cover of night. They carried with them a treasure, though what it was, no one can say. It was not gold or jewels, for nothing of that sort was ever recovered. It was something far more precious, something worth risking death to protect. Speculation abounds as to what this treasure might have been. Some believe it was sacred texts, perhaps Gnostic Gospels or secret writings about Magdalene. Others suggest it was genealogical records of the bloodline, proof of Christ's descendants carried forward in silence. Still others claim it was the Grail itself. Not a cup, but the symbolic vessel of the bloodline, encoded in relics or artifacts. Whatever the truth, the treasure vanished into legend, carried perhaps to hidden safe houses, monasteries, or even into the custody of the Templars, who were themselves active in the region. The parallels between the Cathars and the Templars are striking. Both emerged in the very lands where Magdalene's traditions were strongest. Both rejected, or at least sidestepped, the authority of Rome. Both were accused of heresy, secrecy, and blasphemy. And both were ultimately destroyed by church and crown working hand in hand. It is almost as if both groups were linked by an invisible thread, guardians of knowledge that could not be spoken openly, custodians of a secret that Rome feared more than armies or kings. The fall of Montsegur did not end the mystery. Pilgrims still climb the mountain to this day, calling it the Mountain of the Cathars. Legends linger that tunnels beneath the fortress hide undiscovered chambers, perhaps even containing relics yet untouched. Folklore insists that the Cathar treasure was never lost, only hidden, waiting for the right time to resurface. To some esoteric groups, Montsegur represents the gateway to a secret tradition that survived in whispers, carried on in troubadour songs, alchemical symbols, and the lore of later secret societies. The Church's determination to erase the Cathars was not simply about stamping out heresy. It was about control of history itself. The Cathars challenged Rome's monopoly not just on ritual, but on truth. If they possessed proof of an alternative Christianity, one centered on Magdalene, on secret teachings, or even on the existence of Christ's bloodline, then their very existence threatened to collapse the edifice of papal power. Their extermination, brutal as it was, must be seen as part of a larger pattern. The systematic suppression of anything that might expose the forbidden bloodline, the secret inheritance of Christ hidden in southern France. And yet, as with the Templars, suppression never means disappearance. The Cathar spirit lived on in legend, in folklore, in esoteric circles that claimed descent from their teachings. It is said that some survivors blended into the local population, carrying their beliefs in secret. Troubadours encoded Cathar lore in songs of courtly love, where the lady symbolized not merely earthly affection, but the hidden Sophia, divine wisdom passed through the feminine. Others claim that Cathar knowledge merged into the underground currents that would later surface in alchemy, Rosicrucianism, and even Freemasonry. The destruction of Montsegur was a tragedy, but it was also an attempt to bury something powerful. Whether there was a set of sacred texts, a relic of unimaginable importance, or the living memory of a bloodline, we cannot say with certainty. But what is clear is that the Cathars carried forward a vision of Christianity utterly different from Rome's, one that honored Magdalene and whispered of truths the Church could never allow to surface. Their annihilation was meant to silence those whispers forever. Yet whispers have a way of surviving. They echo across centuries, resurfacing in myths of treasure hidden in mountains, in stories of the Grail, in the haunting memory of men and women who walked willingly into the fire rather than betray their truth. And perhaps, hidden beneath those echoes, lies the most dangerous possibility of all, that the Cathars were not merely heretics, but guardians of Christ's forbidden bloodline, extinguished in flame but not in memory. If the shadowy threads of suppressed history have taught us anything, it is that power is never only about armies or crowns. It is about stories, and more importantly, who controls them. By the 12th century, Europe was not only a place of castles and crusades, but of whispered rumors that could destabilize kingdoms and unsettle the faithful. It was in this charged atmosphere that a group of men, draped in white mantles with red crosses, rose to prominence: the Knights Templar. Officially, they were a monastic order of warrior monks sworn to protect pilgrims on the road to the Holy Land. Yet their swift accumulation of wealth, political influence, and knowledge soon drew suspicion. Some chroniclers have suggested that the Templars were not merely protectors of pilgrims, but guardians of something far older, far more dangerous: the bloodline of Christ himself. The connection between the Templars and the sacred bloodline is one of history's most tantalizing enigmas. At the heart of this theory is the idea that during their excavations beneath the ruins of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, the Templars stumbled upon secrets that could shatter the foundations of the Church. What if among the relics, manuscripts, or artifacts they uncovered was evidence that Jesus had not died a solitary messianic figure, but had left behind a family? The implications would have been earth-shattering. The very premise of the Church's authority, which rested on the idea of Christ as divine, singular, and eternal, would be compromised if he were revealed as a man with heirs. Such knowledge, if held by the Templars, would explain their meteoric rise and the way rulers and even popes treated them with both reverence and fear. Legends claim that the Templars unearthed not only relics like the Ark of the Covenant or the fabled Holy Grail, but also documents describing the descent of Christ's lineage through the Merovingian kings of France. This, some theorists suggest, was the real treasure of the Templars, bloodline knowledge preserved from annihilation, carried through time like an ember hidden under ash. This treasure would not glitter like gold, but it could upend the moral and political order of Europe. Imagine the leverage it gave them, to hold the church itself hostage, not with swords, but with secrets. As the Templars established commanderies across Europe, their secrecy deepened. They became bankers to kings, organizers of crusades, and silent arbiters of continental politics. Yet, in their ceremonies and rituals, hints of older traditions seem to flicker through. Some scholars argue that beneath the surface of Orthodox Catholicism, the Templars carried a hidden esoteric current, a reverence for a divine feminine principle, a protection of a bloodline descended from the union of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, and perhaps even an understanding that true power lay in balancing the masculine authority of the church with the feminine wisdom it had repressed. Such ideas, if voiced openly, would have branded them heretics. But in the secrecy of their chapels and under the watch of the stars, they may have whispered another truth. It is not difficult to see why the church eventually turned against them. In 1307, under orders from King Philip IV of France, the Templars were arrested en masse, accused of heresy, blasphemy, and unspeakable rituals. Yet beneath the accusations of spitting on the cross or worshipping strange idols lies the suspicion that the Templars were destroyed not for what they did, but for what they knew. Could it be that their real crime was the possession of a secret too dangerous to ever be spoken aloud? A secret of bloodlines and heirs, of a Christ who was not merely a divine Savior, but a man whose descendants walked the earth? As we look deeper, symbols tied to the Templars begin to take on new resonance. The chalice, often associated with the Holy Grail, becomes more than a cup. It becomes a metaphor for the womb, the vessel of sacred blood. Some traditions even say that the Grail was not an object at all, but a bloodline, a lineage carried forward through generations, hidden in plain sight within Europe's noble houses. The Templars in this telling were the protectors of that lineage, shielding it from those who would obliterate it to preserve the singular divinity of Christ. Their secrecy, their rituals, their immense wealth, all of it could be reinterpreted as part of a centuries-long mission to guard not gold or relics, but people. The resonance of these ideas is amplified when we consider the suddenness of their downfall. In a single night, the mightiest order in Christendom was brought low, their leaders tortured, their archives seized, their properties confiscated. Yet rumors persisted that not all was lost. Fleets vanished, treasures disappeared, and whispers of surviving Templars spread across Europe. What, one might ask, were they hiding so desperately that they scattered to the winds rather than surrender it to their enemies? Was it mere wealth, or was it knowledge, protected in blood and parchment, that could never be allowed to reach the wrong hands? For those who believe in the forbidden bloodline, the story of the Templars is a crucial chapter. It represents the moment when the guardians of that secret came under direct assault by both crown and church. Their silence under torture. Many chose to die rather than reveal their inner mysteries, suggests a loyalty to something greater than themselves. They could endure the fire, the rack, and the noose, but not the betrayal of what they protected. And that raises the most haunting possibility of all, that their secret survived, perhaps carried by those who fled to Scotland, Portugal, or even across the sea to lands unknown. If this is true, then the Templars did not fall. They merely disappeared, taking their forbidden knowledge with them. From this perspective, the Templars become not only warriors and monks, but curators of an alternate history, an unbroken line of truth hidden behind the facade of the Church's official story. The notion that Christ's bloodline persisted, protected by those with the power and secrecy to preserve it, transforms the Templar legacy from a medieval footnote into a pivotal force shaping the destiny of Europe. For if the bloodline truly existed, then its survival mattered far more than battles fought or castles lost. It mattered because it meant that Christ's presence on earth did not end with the crucifixion. It continued in flesh and blood, in children and descendants, in a line the Church dared not acknowledge. As centuries pass, the image of the Templars oscillates between holy warriors and heretics, bankers and mystics, martyrs and conspirators. But when viewed through the lens of the forbidden bloodline, their mystery deepens. Their wealth becomes leverage. Their secrecy becomes necessity. Their downfall becomes inevitability. And the whispers of their survival ignite the imagination. What if somewhere, hidden in the roots of European nobility, the blood of Christ still flows, preserved by those who once wore the Red Cross? In exploring this possibility, we are reminded of the enduring power of hidden histories. The Templars' fate tells us that truths too dangerous for the world are not destroyed. They are buried, waiting to be unearthed. Their story, then, is not merely about what was lost, but about what might still endure. A bloodline protected by shadows, defended by secrecy, and carried across time by those sworn to guard it until the world is ready to know. If the Templars represented the militant guardians of a forbidden secret, then the Cathars embodied the spiritual resistance to the same orthodox authority. They were, in many ways, the mirror opposite of the Church that condemned them. Where Rome declared dogma, the Cathars whispered of hidden truths. Where the Church demanded obedience to hierarchy, the Cathars spoke of purity of spirit and the dual nature of the universe. They flourished in the Languedoc region of southern France during the 12th and 13th centuries, a place where troubadours sang of love and knights courted ideals of chivalry. Yet behind the poetry and songs was a movement that challenged the very core of Christian orthodoxy. The Cathars believed in a world divided between forces of light and forces of darkness, and they rejected much of the materialism and corruption they saw in the established Church. But within their beliefs lurks a deeper mystery, one that has long fascinated historians and seekers alike: their possible connection to the bloodline of Christ. The Cathars referred to themselves as the good men or the good Christians, and their rituals were strikingly different from those of Catholic priests. They rejected baptism by water, preferring a spiritual rite called the consolamentum, which was more a transmission of spiritual power than a simple ritual. They rejected the Catholic sacrament of the Eucharist, believing instead that divine presence could not be captured in bread and wine. And most provocatively, they seemed to elevate a feminine principle within their worldview, a reverence for Sophia, the embodiment of divine wisdom. To some scholars, this devotion echoes the role of Mary Magdalene, who in Gnostic traditions is not a fallen sinner, but Christ's most intimate companion, perhaps even the vessel of his bloodline. The Cathars' alignment with these suppressed traditions has led many to speculate that their true crime in the eyes of the Church was not heresy alone, but their role as preservers of a deeper lineage. The Church's response was brutal. In 1209, Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade, a campaign of extermination against the Cathars. What followed was one of the most ruthless episodes of medieval Europe. Entire towns slaughtered, populations put to the sword, and villages reduced to ash. The infamous phrase attributed to the papal legate, "Kill them all, God will know his own," illustrates the merciless intent behind the campaign. To the Church, this was not simply a war of religion, but a war against dangerous knowledge. For if the Cathars truly held or whispered of a bloodline descending from Christ and Mary Magdalene, their teachings could unravel the authority of Rome itself. Their elimination, then, was as much about suppressing hidden truths as it was about eradicating dissent. The last great stronghold of the Cathars was the fortress of Montségur, perched high in the Pyrenees like an eagle's nest. For months, Catholic forces besieged it, knowing that within its walls lay not only men and women of unshakable faith, but also, perhaps, relics, or documents of immense value. According to legends that persist to this day, just before Montsegur fell in 1244, a small group of Cathars slipped away under cover of night, carrying with them a mysterious treasure. What this treasure was has been the subject of centuries of speculation. Was it gold? Was it sacred manuscripts? Or was it something far more explosive, evidence of Christ's bloodline, preserved and entrusted to the Cathar guardians? The secrecy surrounding this treasure suggests that its value was not material but symbolic, not wealth but revelation. Those who escaped may have carried with them the same ember of truth that the Templars were said to protect. If the Cathars were indeed linked to the bloodline, it would explain the ferocity with which they were pursued and obliterated. The Church could tolerate dissenting sects, rival theologies, even occasional uprisings. What it could not tolerate was the possibility that the very foundation of its power, the singular divinity of Christ, was undercut by a lineage hidden within the very land it governed. In this context, the massacre at Montsegur takes on a darker dimension. It was not only the burning of heretics, but the attempted obliteration of a hidden truth, one that threatened to upend the established order of Europe. Even after their destruction, the Cathars left behind echoes that refused to fade. Their songs, their symbols, their stories passed in a folklore, hinting at mysteries never fully explained. In the villages of southern France, whispers of the Holy Family persisted, entwined with tales of Magdalene's journey to Gaul, where she was said to have landed after fleeing the Holy Land. Some traditions hold that she brought with her not only relics but children, the beginnings of the bloodline that would merge with the Merovingian dynasty. The Cathars, inheritors of these whispers, may have been less a random heretical sect than a continuation of a much older current stretching back to the 1st century. If this is true, then their extermination was nothing less than a deliberate attempt to erase a chapter of history too dangerous to acknowledge. The ruins of Montsegur today are quiet, haunted by the ghosts of those who perished in the flames below the fortress. Yet to those who walk among its stones, there is a palpable sense of mystery, as though the air itself remembers secrets the world was not meant to hear. Some modern researchers and esoteric traditions claim that Montsegur was more than a fortress. It was a Grail castle, a place where the lineage of Christ was honored and safeguarded. In this interpretation, the fall of Montsegur mirrors the fall of Camelot in Arthurian legend, another tale that encodes the mysteries of the Grail and the bloodline. Could it be that these legends are not separate, but intertwined, each preserving fragments of a forbidden story hidden within myth? What is undeniable is that the Cathars represented a direct challenge to the Church's narrative. Their refusal to acknowledge the authority of priests, their rejection of sacraments, their reverence for the feminine, and their whispered associations with the Magdalene all point toward a dangerous knowledge suppressed by fire and sword. The eradication of the Cathars, like the destruction of the Templars, fits a larger pattern: the systematic silencing of those who might protect the secret of Christ's descendants. Each crusade, each inquisition, each massacre can be reinterpreted not simply as a defense of orthodoxy, but as a campaign against memory itself, a memory that refused to die even as bodies burned. Yet suppression breeds fascination. The very attempt to erase the Cathars has ensured their immortality in legend. Today, their story draws seekers from around the world to the Languedoc, where ruins whisper of forgotten truths and the landscape itself feels charged with mystery. To some, the Cathars were martyrs for a secret they could never reveal. To others, they were guardians of a sacred lineage that outlived them, carried in silence to other lands, hidden in plain sight, awaiting rediscovery. Their ashes may have scattered on the winds of the Pyrenees, but the question they leave behind still burns. What were they protecting that the Church so desperately sought to erase? And so, the Cathars joined the Templars in the long shadow of suppressed history. Both groups may have been very different in practice. The Templars wealthy and militarized, the Cathars humble and spiritual. But in the deeper current of conspiracy, they converge. Both stand accused of heresy both annihilated by the Church, and both tied by rumor and legend to the same forbidden thread, the bloodline of Christ. If they were, in truth, guardians of that secret, then their destruction was not simply a matter of theology or politics. It was a matter of silencing history itself. The story they hint at, a lineage hidden, a truth denied, remains the one narrative the Church could never afford to let the world hear. If the Cathars were silenced in fire and the Templars broken upon the rack, the question remains, did the secret they guarded vanish with them? Or did it slip through the cracks of history, carried into the future by those determined to preserve it? It is here, in the shadowed centuries that followed their destruction, that the story takes on an even more elusive form. Across Europe, whispers of a hidden lineage refused to die. The idea that Christ had heirs, flesh and blood descendants, continued to flicker in secret societies, in esoteric orders, and in the faint threads of legend woven into the cultural fabric of France. Chief among these was the myth of the Merovingians, the so-called sacred kings of the Franks, whose dynasty became entangled in the bloodline mystery like no other. The Merovingian kings, who ruled from the 5th to the 8th centuries, were remembered for their long hair, which they wore as a symbol of their sacred status. Their reign gave birth to legends of supernatural origins, with some chroniclers claiming they descended from a sea creature, while others suggested a more earthly, yet far more dangerous explanation, that their line was of holy descent. The speculation that the Merovingians were direct descendants of Jesus and Mary Magdalene was not a medieval invention, but a thread that seems to have been woven into the fabric of folklore long before modern theorists revived it. It was whispered in monasteries, hinted at in obscure manuscripts, and enshrined in the very reverence accorded to this dynasty. Why? After all, were the Merovingians treated with such awe, their kings seen as almost untouchable, their authority imbued with a mysticism beyond mere political power? The bloodline theory offers one haunting answer. If indeed the Merovingians carried the sacred blood, then their eventual overthrow by the Carolingians in the 8th century becomes more than a political coup. It becomes another deliberate act of suppression. The papacy, aligning itself with the rising Carolingian dynasty, sanctioned the displacement of the Merovingian kings, effectively severing their line from power. Once again, we see the pattern. Whenever the bloodline rose close to visibility, the established order struck to obscure it, replacing inconvenient dynasties with pliant ones, rewriting history to suit the Church's narrative. But bloodlines, unlike kingdoms, do not vanish with a throne. They flow quietly through marriages, hidden in the veins of children, mingling with noble houses until they become untraceable, yet enduring. It is in this context that we must examine the legends of the Priory of Sion, a shadowy brotherhood said to have existed for centuries, tasked with one mission: the protection of the bloodline of Christ. The Priory emerges in documents known as the Dossier's Secrets, discovered in Paris in the 20th century, but purporting to trace the group's origins back to the medieval world. These papers claimed that the Priory safeguarded not only secret knowledge, but living descendants of Christ's line, ensuring their survival through centuries of turmoil. Critics have dismissed the Priory as a fabrication, a hoax spun from modern imaginations. And yet, within the conspiracy, the Priory fits perfectly into the larger puzzle. If the Templars were the militant arm and the Cathars the spiritual heirs, then the Priory becomes the invisible thread tying their missions together across time. The documents suggest a continuity of guardianship, that after the fall of Montségur and the suppression of the Templars, remnants of these groups preserved. The lineage in secrecy, adapting to changing times, cloaking themselves in invisibility. Their goal was not to rule openly, but to protect, to bide their time until the world might be ready to face the truth. According to these claims, the Priory maintained careful genealogies, hidden records mapping the survival of the bloodline through noble families in France and beyond. If this is true, then the story of European history takes on an entirely new complexion. Dynastic marriages, political alliances, sudden downfalls. all could be reinterpreted as maneuvers not simply of ambition, but of concealment or preservation. One name often tied to these mysteries is that of René d'Anjou, a 15th-century duke and patron of esoteric traditions, who some allege was a Grand Master of the Priory. Under his watch, the lore of the Grail and the bloodline flourished in art and literature, cloaked as chivalric romance, yet carrying echoes of forbidden truths. The Grail legends that spread during this era, tales of a sacred vessel, of knights seeking a divine relic, may not have been about an actual cup at all. Rather, they may have been allegories, coded narratives meant to preserve the memory of the bloodline in story form. In this reading, the Grail is the womb, the vessel of sacred blood, and the knights who sought it were symbolic of those sworn to protect the lineage through the centuries. Thus, myth itself becomes a camouflage, a way of hiding the unutterable truth in plain sight, safe from inquisitors yet available to those with the eyes to see. The threads grow even stranger when we turn to the mysterious village of Rennes-le-Château in southern France. In the late 19th century, a humble parish priest named Béranger Saunière suddenly became inexplicably wealthy after supposedly discovering hidden documents in his church. His renovations included strange symbols, inscriptions, and designs that seemed to hint at arcane knowledge. Rumors swirled that Saunière had uncovered evidence of Christ's bloodline, and that his fortune was granted in exchange for his silence. Rennes-le-Château quickly became a magnet for theorists, seekers, and occultists, all convinced that beneath its quiet stones lay a secret the church would kill to conceal. For many, it represented the physical proof that the bloodline had not vanished, that the priory and its guardians had left a trail, however faint, for the world to follow. The persistence of these legends suggests something remarkable, that even when every effort was made to burn records, destroy heresies, and silence voices, the memory of a hidden lineage refused to be extinguished. It resurfaced in different guises, in dynastic myths, in esoteric brotherhoods, in local legends, in coded stories of Grail quests. Like a river forced underground, it kept flowing, invisible but unstoppable, carving its way through the bedrock of European consciousness until it found cracks to rise again. Of course, skeptics argue that all of this is nothing more than imaginative myth-making, a tapestry of coincidence and forgery woven into conspiracy. And yet, even if the Priory of Sion is dismissed as invention, the deeper question remains unanswered. Why does this idea, the survival of Christ's bloodline, resurface again and again across so many contexts, from the Templars to the Cathars, from the Merovingians to Rennes-le-Château? Why does it persist with such tenacity if it is merely fabrication? Perhaps because hidden within the noise lies a signal, a truth half-remembered, too dangerous to acknowledge outright, yet too powerful to erase completely. Legends may grow around a kernel of reality, and the obsessive attempts to suppress such stories may themselves be evidence of what they conceal. By the time we reach the modern era, the bloodline theory has become the foundation of countless books, theories, and cultural fascinations. Yet beneath the layers of speculation remains the same haunting possibility that began centuries ago, that Christ's life did not end upon the cross, that he left behind a family, and that this family's survival has been guarded through fire, blood, and silence by those who saw themselves as custodians of a forbidden truth. If this is indeed the case, then history itself has been rewritten, not once, but repeatedly, with each suppression marking another attempt to bury the lineage deeper, to shroud it in mystery so complete that only fragments would ever resurface. The Templars, the Cathars, the Merovingians, the Priory, Rennes-le-Château, all are fragments of the same mosaic. Together they suggest a story running beneath the surface of Western civilization, invisible to the eye yet shaping destinies, altering power structures, and haunting the imagination of those who sense that the past is not what we have been told. The question is no longer whether the story exists, but whether we have the courage to peer into it, to consider what it might mean if the bloodline of Christ truly endures, hidden in plain sight, waiting for a revelation that could change everything we thought we knew about faith, power, and history itself. As the centuries turned and the world inched toward modernity, the whispers of Christ's bloodline did not vanish. They transformed. The Renaissance breathed new life into forgotten texts and hidden knowledge, reviving Gnostic currents that the Church had long tried to suppress. Artists, scholars, and secret orders alike seemed to draw from wells of inspiration that hinted at mysteries just beneath the surface. It was in this shifting intellectual climate that the story of the forbidden bloodline began to weave itself into the cultural and political fabric of Europe in ways both subtle and overt. The Grail legends, once confined to the courts of medieval troubadours, found new expression in allegorical paintings and cryptic writings, where the imagery of chalices, roses, and sacred unions was given fresh layers of meaning. To those who knew how to read them, these symbols spoke not only of spiritual ideals, but of a lineage alive, hidden, and waiting. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Europe became a laboratory for secret societies. The Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, and a host of lesser-known orders emerged, each cloaking their rituals in symbolism drawn from ancient mysteries. While not all these groups claimed ties to the bloodline, many adopted imagery and allegories that resonated with its themes. The Masons, for example, emphasized the building of a temple not of stone but of spirit, yet their lore of hidden architects and lost secrets dovetailed eerily with a narrative of guardianship stretching back to the Templars. Rosicrucian manifestos, with their talk of invisible colleges and secret wisdom passed from generation to generation, likewise seem to echo the idea of a hidden lineage protected in silence. Were these societies conscious heirs to the secret, or had the myth infiltrated their symbols as a persistent undercurrent of European imagination? The ambiguity itself became part of the allure. At the same time, France remained a focal point for the mystery. From the legends of Mary Magdalene's arrival in Provence to the enigmatic wealth of Bérenger Saunière in Rennes-le-Château, the country seemed to host an unbroken thread connecting the ancient past to the modern world. The south of France, in particular, became a landscape saturated with memory, its caves, chapels, and villages whispering of secrets too dangerous to write openly. Pilgrims and seekers who wandered these hills often felt an uncanny sense that history here had two faces, one public and orthodox, the other hidden and heretical. The stones themselves seemed to resist forgetfulness, holding on to a memory of Magdalene as not only a penitent saint, but as the mother of a sacred bloodline. It was in this charged atmosphere that literature began to take on the role of custodian. The Romantic and Gothic writers of the 19th century infused their works with imagery of secret lineages, cursed families, and hidden inheritances. Victor Hugo, with his fascination for symbols and esoteric codes, was rumored by some to be aware of bloodline traditions. His cryptic writings, his obsession with architecture, and his subtle references to the mysteries of Rennes-le-Château have led some to speculate that he was a link in the chain of those who knew. Even if this remains unproven, it reveals the way the idea had permeated culture, not just through explicit doctrine, but through the very stories people told, the art they created, the myths they revived. By the late 19th century, Europe was alive with esoteric revival. Theosophists, occultists, and spiritualists scoured ancient texts, trying to recover what the Church had long denied. Figures like Helena Blavatsky spoke of hidden masters and secret wisdom preserved through the ages, and while her focus ranged across traditions from Tibet to Egypt, the theme of a hidden lineage, of truths carried silently through generations, echoed the bloodline narrative. In parallel, local legends around Rennes-le-Château grew louder. Saunière's inexplicable wealth, his cryptic church decorations, and the peculiar symbols he installed, all seemed to suggest that he had stumbled upon something extraordinary. Whether documents, relics, or proof of the bloodline itself, his silence and sudden prosperity ignited speculation that persists to this day. The fascination with these mysteries did not remain confined to fringe circles. As Europe marched toward the 20th century, the currents of hidden lineage and esoteric brotherhood began to intersect with mainstream politics in unsettling ways. In Germany, the rise of occult-tinged nationalist movements revealed how dangerous these ideas could become when twisted for power. Secret orders like the Thule Society drew upon myths of ancient bloodlines to craft ideologies of superiority, replacing sacred lineage with racial myth. In their hands, the archetype of hidden descent became a tool of exclusion and domination. While the bloodline of Christ itself may not have been their focus, the very concept that hidden genealogies could confer power proved seductive enough to shape movements that would plunge the world into darkness. And yet, even amid such distortions, the forbidden narrative endured in its purer form. The 20th century saw an explosion of scholarship and speculation around the mysteries of the Grail, the Templars, and Rennes-le-Château. Books such as Holy Blood, Holy Grail popularized the idea that the Church had concealed not just relics, but a living lineage, and that modern Europe itself was unknowingly shaped by the descendants of Christ. The theory captured the imagination of millions, not because it was proven, but because it resonated with the sense that history is never as simple as the official story. The public craved the possibility that beneath centuries of dogma lay a more human, more intimate truth, that Christ had loved, had partnered, had fathered children whose lives were woven into the same fabric as our own. As the bloodline theory entered popular consciousness, it began to change the way people viewed history itself. Suddenly, the fall of the Merovingians, the destruction of the Cathars, the suppression of the Templars, and the wealth of Sion were no longer isolated events, but connected dots in a vast conspiracy to suppress a single truth. What had once seemed like scattered anomalies now formed a pattern. And once you saw the pattern, it was impossible to unsee it. History became less a record of events and more a chessboard, where every move of kings, popes, and empires could be reinterpreted as part of a struggle to reveal or conceal the forbidden bloodline. The 20th century also introduced a new element, the democratization of secrets. No longer were these ideas confined to monks, nobles, or initiates of secret societies. Through books, documentaries, and later, films, the public itself became the audience for the forbidden narrative. The very act of speculation became a kind of initiation. Readers and viewers drawn into a web of clues, symbols, and hidden histories, invited to see the world not as it is told, but as it might secretly be. The line between myth and history blurred, and in that blur, the bloodline took on a strange kind of reality. For even if one doubted the literal existence of Christ's descendants, the story itself carried power, reshaping imaginations and challenging the authority of official history. What is perhaps most remarkable is how resilient this narrative has proven to be. Every attempt to silence it, whether through crusades, inquisitions, or ridicule, has only deepened its allure. Each suppression becomes part of the conspiracy, each denial another clue that the secret must be real. Like the Grail itself, the bloodline remains both elusive and magnetic, pulling seekers deeper into its mystery. It becomes less about whether the lineage exists and more about what it symbolizes: resistance against imposed narratives, the endurance of hidden truths, the possibility that beneath the surface of history lies a reality too explosive to acknowledge openly. And so, by the dawn of the 21st century, the forbidden bloodline had become more than a theory. It had become a cultural archetype. Whether through the pages of speculative history, the art of Renaissance masters, the ruins of Qatar castles, or the cryptic wealth of a village priest, the story continued to haunt. It is the ghost that refuses to be exorcised, the question that cannot be silenced. If it is only myth, then is a myth so powerful that it has shaped centuries of obsession, violence, and secrecy. And if it is true, then it is nothing less than the most explosive secret in human history. The lineage, whether symbolic or literal, casts a long shadow. From the ashes of Montsegur to the vaults of the Vatican, From the tombs of forgotten kings to the dusty archives of modern libraries, the trace of it lingers. To look for it is to look not only for Christ's descendants, but for the hidden face of history itself. And in that search, one begins to sense why so many have died to protect it, and why so many more have killed to suppress it. It is not simply a story. It is a battlefield, one where truth and power meet, where myth and history are indistinguishable, and where the stakes are nothing less than the authority to define what is sacred. If the story of the forbidden bloodline had, for centuries, been confined to whispers among heretics, troubadours, and secret orders, the modern era saw it pushed into the open like never before. The 20th century became the stage where speculation, scholarship, and myth collided, producing a landscape where ancient secrets were suddenly reinterpreted in light of archaeology, literature, and even pop culture. The shift was dramatic. What once belonged to esoteric societies and half-buried chronicles now found its way into bookstores, lecture halls, and eventually into living rooms across the world. And yet, far from diminishing the mystery, this exposure only deepened it, drawing millions into the labyrinth and forcing the question once again. Was there truly a bloodline the Church tried to erase? And if so, where could its descendants be found today? The story began its modern resurgence with discoveries in dusty archives and the emergence of fringe scholars who were willing to ask questions the academic establishment refused to touch. In the 1950s and 1960s, researchers stumbled upon references to mysterious documents known as the Dossier Secrets, allegedly deposited in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. These documents, cloaked in mystery, spoke of the Priory of Sion, an ancient brotherhood said to guard the lineage of Christ. The Priory, if the records were to be believed, had counted among its members some of Europe's greatest minds: Leonardo da Vinci, Botticelli, Newton, all men whose genius was suddenly reframed as part of a greater, hidden mission. Skeptics dismissed the documents as forgeries, but believers saw in them a tantalizing confirmation of rumors whispered since the time of the Merovingians. The very ambiguity was fuel for fascination. If false, why plant such documents at all? And if real, what did it mean for everything we thought we knew about European history? The Dossier's secrets were only the beginning. By the 1980s, the mystery reached a fever pitch with the publication of Holy Blood, Holy Grail by Michael Bygent, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln. This work stitched together the fragments of legend, the anomalies of history, and the tantalizing whispers of secret documents into a narrative so compelling that it could not be ignored. The book proposed that Jesus and Mary Magdalene had married, had children, and that their descendants had intermarried with the Merovingian dynasty of France, producing a sacred bloodline that rivaled papal authority. According to the authors, this lineage had been safeguarded for centuries by secret societies like the Priory of Sion and even the Knights Templar before them. What was remarkable was not only the boldness of the claim, but the meticulous web of evidence presented. Maps of southern France, genealogies of forgotten kings, coded messages hidden in church architecture. Suddenly, the conspiracy was no longer just a shadowy legend. It had been given form, argument, and narrative. The impact was immediate. Scholars debated, the church remained silent, and readers devoured the book as though it held the key to rewriting Christian history. It ignited a firestorm of curiosity that reached far beyond academia. Suddenly, tourists flocked to Rennes-le-Château, the tiny French village at the heart of Saunière's mysterious fortune, combing its hills and churches for signs of buried treasure or secret documents. Amateur researchers created elaborate genealogical charts linking ancient dynasties to supposed modern heirs of Christ. The idea of the bloodline, once confined to hushed speculation, was now alive in the public imagination, sparking pilgrimages, documentaries, and endless theories. The line between historical investigation and myth-making blurred so completely that even skeptics found themselves caught in the momentum of the story. The Church, for its part, maintained its long-standing silence. Officially, the Vatican dismissed such ideas as sensationalist fiction, unworthy of serious response. Yet in this silence, many found confirmation of suppression. Why, they asked if the theory was so absurd to the church. Not confront it directly, disprove it decisively, and remove the allure once and for all? Why leave the narrative to grow unchecked, unless the risk of engagement was too great? The absence of denial became, paradoxically, a kind of proof for the believers. It was as though the Vatican preferred the theory to be dismissed as conspiracy than to risk a direct debate that might uncover inconvenient truths. As the decades unfolded, the cultural impact of the bloodline theory only expanded. Filmmakers, novelists, and artists seized upon the imagery of sacred unions, hidden lineages, and suppressed truths. Perhaps the most famous of these was Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, which, though fiction, borrowed heavily from the arguments of Holy Blood, Holy Grail. The novel introduced millions to the idea of Mary Magdalene as the Holy Grail, not a cup but a womb, a vessel of sacred blood. The story of Jesus and Magdalene's marriage, the Priory of Sion, and the coded messages hidden in Leonardo's paintings entered mainstream consciousness in a way no scholarly work could have achieved alone. What had once been the province of fringe researchers was now dinner-table conversation, global box office success, and a permanent fixture in the imagination of modern culture. Critics, of course, pushed back. Historians pointed out inconsistencies, questioned the authenticity of the dossier's secrets, and accused authors of weaving elaborate myths out of half-truths and coincidence. The Catholic Church, too, finally responded in more direct terms, condemning works like the Da Vinci Code as dangerous distortions of faith. But even these denials often backfired. For every attempt to discredit the theory, more people became curious, more books were sold, more documentaries were made. Suppression once again worked like oxygen to the fire, feeding the mystery rather than extinguishing it. The idea of a forbidden bloodline, whether true or not, had achieved what legends often do. It had become unkillable. And while cultural fascination soared, serious researchers continued to unearth strange anomalies that kept the theory alive. Archaeologists uncovered burial sites in southern France with unusual symbols, suggesting a connection to early Christian sections. Genetic studies of ancient remains revealed lineages that did not quite fit official genealogies of medieval nobility. Even the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in the mid-20th century, reignited debates about early Christianity, showing a diversity of beliefs far greater than the narrow version later canonized by Rome. To some, these discoveries were fragments of a puzzle, pieces of a suppressed truth scattered across centuries and continents. Each new finding seemed to whisper that history's official version was only a partial one, carefully pruned to serve power. The digital age only amplified the phenomenon. Online forums, independent researchers, and video documentaries brought together a global audience eager to connect the dots. No longer dependent on academic approval or mainstream publishers, seekers could now share maps, manuscripts, and theories across borders instantly. The story of the bloodline became a participatory mystery, where thousands contributed their own fragments of evidence or interpretation. In this way, the narrative escaped the bounds of traditional history altogether, becoming a living, evolving myth woven by collective imagination. And yet, even in this democratization, certain themes remained constant. The idea of secrecy, suppression, guardianship, and the eternal struggle between revelation and erasure. What makes the modern phase of the bloodline narrative particularly compelling is its enduring relevance. In a world increasingly distrustful of institutions, the idea that the greatest institution of all, the Church, could have suppressed a truth of cosmic significance resonates deeply. The bloodline becomes not only a question of theology, but a metaphor for hidden truths in general, for histories untold, for voices silenced. It becomes a story about power. Who gets to decide what is remembered and what is forgotten, what is sacred and what is heretical, what is true and what must be denied? To believe in the bloodline, then, is not merely to speculate on Christ's descendants. It is to participate in an act of resistance, to assert that history is not the property of the powerful alone. At the same time, there remains a haunting possibility that beneath the layers of myth and speculation lies a core of fact. Perhaps there was a family, a lineage, whose survival threatened the authority of Rome. Perhaps the Magdalene did carry Christ's children to the south of France, where they mingled with nobility and seeded a dynasty whose blood still flows in veins today. If so, the implications are staggering. It would mean that the entire edifice of Christian orthodoxy, the celibate Christ, the singular divine narrative, the monopoly of the Church, was built on a deliberate omission. It would mean that 2,000 years of history, wars, crusades, and inquisitions were shaped not by truth, but by the desperate attempt to conceal it. The modern fascination with the forbidden bloodline is, in the end, both a mirror and a window. It reflects our hunger for mystery in a world stripped bare by science. But it also opens a window onto the possibility that the past still holds secrets capable of reshaping everything we thought we knew. Whether one believes in its literal existence or not, the bloodline functions as a mythic force, a gravitational center pulling together history, faith, and conspiracy into a narrative too compelling to abandon. It is the story we cannot stop telling, the question we cannot stop asking. What if the greatest secret of Christianity was not salvation through death, but life through love, carried forward in flesh and blood? The modern fascination with the forbidden bloodline did not simply stop at Europe, nor did it remain confined to the boundaries of Christian tradition. As researchers dug deeper, they began to uncover connections, strange parallels and echoes that extended across cultures, religions, and continents. What seemed at first like a uniquely Christian heresy began to look instead like part of a universal mystery, a recurring archetype found in ancient civilizations from the Middle East to India, from Egypt to South America. The possibility emerged that the story of Christ's bloodline was not only about a family hidden in history, but about a pattern of sacred descent itself, a phenomenon older and broader than the Church could ever acknowledge. In this view, the narrative of Jesus and Mary Magdalene was simply the latest expression of a secret far older than Christianity, one passed along like a torch through time. Scholars of comparative mythology began to point out the uncanny similarities. In ancient Egypt, the story of Isis and Osiris described a sacred union that produced Horus, a divine child whose lineage symbolized renewal and kingship. In Mesopotamia, the myth of Inanna and Dumuzi spoke of Hieros Gamos, the sacred marriage between a divine feminine and a mortal king, a union that ensured fertility and the continuation of dynasties. In India, traditions surrounding Krishna and Radha evoked a similar theme of love transcending the mortal plane, with their relationship becoming a metaphor for cosmic balance and divine union. Time and again, across cultures, one sees the same motif: a divine or semi-divine couple whose union produces a lineage carrying both human and transcendent qualities. Could it be that the story of Christ and Magdalene was a continuation of this archetype, one that Christianity tried desperately to erase because it threatened the monopoly of divinity vested in a single, celibate Christ? The esoteric traditions of the West certainly thought so. Gnostic texts like the Gospel of Philip hint at a deep and intimate connection between Jesus and Mary, speaking of her as his companion and describing a union that shocked later theologians. The Cathars, with their reverence for the divine feminine, seemed to preserve echoes of this suppressed knowledge. Even the Templars, accused of worshipping a mysterious female figure called Sophia, or sometimes simply the Black Madonna, may have been safeguarding an ancient awareness of sacred marriage and its implications for lineage. The more one looks, the more it becomes clear that the bloodline is not an isolated idea, but the culmination of a current that runs beneath Western religion like an underground river, surfacing only when suppression loosens for a moment before vanishing again. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, seekers began to connect these dots with increasing boldness. The Magdalene was no longer seen merely as a historical figure, but as an embodiment of the sacred feminine, a counterpart to Christ whose role had been deliberately diminished by patriarchal authority. To restore her to her rightful place was not simply to correct a historical oversight. It was to restore balance to a tradition that had tilted dangerously toward suppression of the feminine. The bloodline, in this light, symbolized not only hidden heirs but the possibility of a restored harmony between masculine and feminine principles in spirituality itself. Some researchers went further, suggesting that Magdalene's bloodline represented the reintroduction of Sophia, the divine wisdom, into a world dominated by hierarchical, masculine structures of power. If Christ embodied logos, divine word, then Magdalene embodied gnosis, divine wisdom. Their union was both literal and symbolic, producing not just children, but an entire spiritual paradigm threatening to the Church. The imagery of the Grail suddenly took on new meaning in this context. No longer merely a chalice, the Grail became the symbol of the womb, the vessel of life, the continuation of divine presence in flesh and blood. To search for the Grail, then, was to search not for an object, but for a lineage, a continuity of spirit through descendants. The medieval stories of knights questing for the Grail could now be read as allegories for protectors of this bloodline, guardians of a secret too precious to be lost. The quest was never about drinking from a cup. It was about ensuring that the living vessel of Christ's legacy, the union of Magdalene and her descendants, survived against all odds. Suddenly, the Grail legends, the Cathar mysteries, and the suppressed Gospels all converged into one breathtaking vision. History itself was a battlefield over the fate of this hidden inheritance. But what happened to the bloodline as history marched forward? Some researchers pointed to the Merovingians, the early Frankish dynasty, as heirs of this sacred descent. The Merovingians were said to have ruled with a kind of mystical legitimacy, their long-haired kings seen as possessing supernatural authority, a claim that the Church never fully embraced and eventually undermined. When the Carolingians replaced them, supported by papal blessing, it was more than just dynastic succession. It was perhaps a deliberate attempt to erase the sacred bloodline from political power. Yet the rumor persisted that the lineage did not die but went underground, intermarrying with noble houses, passing silently from generation to generation. The Priory of Sion, whether real or invented, became the mythical custodian of this continuity, a symbol of guardianship that could not be destroyed no matter how many times the Church tried to silence it. The implication of this possibility is staggering. If Christ's bloodline survived into Europe's nobility, then many of the continent's wars, dynastic marriages, and political intrigues could be reinterpreted as part of a silent battle over the control or suppression of this inheritance. Suddenly, history's great dramas, from the Crusades to the wars of religion, appear less as isolated struggles and more as echoes of a hidden war over legitimacy itself. To possess the bloodline was to challenge the Church's monopoly on divine authority. To erase, it was to ensure Rome's uncontested power. Every burned Cathar, every silenced Templar, every heretical text destroyed might then be seen not as random cruelty, but as deliberate steps in the eradication of living proof that divinity had entered the world not in a fleeting miracle, but in a lasting family. Modern genetic research has only added fuel to the speculation. Some claim that traces of unique haplogroups in southern France could suggest continuity from the 1st century, a remnant of populations that carried the blood of early Judean migrants. Others point to peculiar anomalies in the genealogies of certain noble houses, sudden insertions of obscure families whose origins are cloaked in mystery. While mainstream science dismisses these claims as speculative, the coincidences are enough to stir the imagination. What if, in some remote chateau or hidden lineage, descendants of Christ and Magdalene still walk among us, unaware of the full weight of their ancestry? Or worse, what if they know, and the silence is part of an unbroken pact of secrecy, enforced for centuries by those who guard the bloodline from the eyes of the world? The deeper one ventures into this labyrinth, the more unsettling the questions become. If the bloodline exists, what responsibility do its heirs carry? Are they to reveal themselves, claiming authority denied for 2 millennia? Or is their role to remain hidden, ensuring that the Church's fragile edifice is not shattered too abruptly? And if the lineage has truly been suppressed, what lengths has Rome, or other powers, gone to in order to keep it in the shadows? Whispers of assassinations, unexplained disappearances, and enigmatic symbols etched into the architecture of churches and palaces all suggest that the struggle is not over. Even in the 21st century, the forbidden bloodline remains dangerous, its revelation capable of shaking the foundations of global faith. For many seekers, however, the literal existence of heirs is less important than what the bloodline represents. It is a metaphor for continuity, for the survival of love and wisdom against overwhelming suppression. It is the reminder that truth, once born, cannot be killed. It can only be driven underground, where it waits patiently to surface again. In this sense, the bloodline is as much spiritual as it is genetic, an unbroken current of knowledge carried not only in blood but in stories, symbols, and dreams. Those who search for it in archives, cathedrals, and landscapes are participating in a quest as old as the Grail Knights themselves, the quest to remember what was deliberately made forgotten. As the 21st century advances, the narrative shows no sign of fading. If anything, it grows stronger, fed by documentaries, novels, and new discoveries. Every unexplained symbol, every anomaly in genealogy, every newly translated gospel is another spark added to the fire. The idea that Christ's legacy continues not in stone relics, but in living blood resonates with a world increasingly disillusioned with institutions and hungry for authenticity. In the age of skepticism, paradoxically, belief in the forbidden bloodline has become a new kind of faith, a faith in the possibility that love, union, and life itself were the true message of Christianity, hidden away because they threaten the structures of power. And so the mystery endures, at once a historical puzzle, a spiritual metaphor, and a cultural obsession. To follow its trail is to wander through time, past the ruins of Montségur, the cathedrals of France, the vaults of the Vatican, the manuscripts of Nag Hammadi, and the secret dossiers of Paris. It is to feel the presence of countless seekers before us, each drawn by the same question, each convinced that somewhere, hidden just beyond the veil of official history, lies the truth the Church tried to erase. Whether one sees it as fact or as myth, the forbidden bloodline has become a living story, a grail quest for the modern age, one that invites us all to become knights and seekers in our own right, chasing the whispers of a lineage that refuses to die. If the story of the forbidden bloodline had survived in whispers, symbols, and legends, then nowhere do its traces feel more ominously preserved than in the locked vaults of the Vatican. For centuries, the Holy See has been both guardian and gatekeeper of Christian history, presiding over the largest archive of religious documents in the world. Stretching for miles beneath Vatican City, the archives are said to contain not only papal bulls, letters, and decrees, but also texts deemed too dangerous, heretical, or destabilizing to release. Access is strictly controlled, granted only to approved scholars under strict guidelines, and even then, vast sections remain entirely off-limits. This veil of secrecy has long fueled speculation. If the bloodline truly existed, then surely the Vatican would hold evidence, either as relics, genealogies, or suppressed gospels, that confirm or deny the story once and for all. And yet, silence remains their strategy, a silence more haunting than denial itself. The idea of hidden documents is not merely fanciful. History records moments when inconvenient truths were deliberately buried or destroyed. The Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in Egypt in 1945, contained gospels and writings of early Christians that painted a very different picture of Christ and his teachings, many emphasizing his humanity, his partnership with Mary, and the diversity of beliefs that flourished before Rome's orthodoxy took hold. Had these writings not been found by accident, they might have remained forever suppressed. This alone suggests the Vatican's caution. If texts that emphasize Magdalene's prominence and hint at secret teachings could survive in the sands of Egypt, how many more such manuscripts lie in the climate-controlled vaults beneath Rome? What secrets remain deliberately hidden because their implications would unravel the very authority of the Church? Artifacts, too, are said to rest in silence. Rumors swirl of reliquaries locked away, bones, relics, chalices, and scrolls that might point toward an alternate history. Some claim that the sarcophagus of Mary Magdalene herself lies in concealment, her body transported from Provence long ago to prevent pilgrimages from threatening Rome's dominance. Others speak of genealogical records smuggled from monasteries, linking noble families to an unbroken descent from Christ. Even more sensational are whispers of blood vials, ancient DNA samples, carefully preserved in secrecy because to test them would risk proving what orthodoxy cannot allow: that divinity once walked the earth not in isolation, but through flesh that continues in the living. Whether these are rumors, legends, or deliberate disinformation planted to deflect seekers, one thing remains certain. The Vatican's silence keeps the world guessing, and in guessing, the bloodline remains alive. The tension between revelation and suppression grows sharper when one considers the Church's history of violent secrecy. The Inquisition was not merely about rooting out heresy. It was about destroying documents, silencing voices, and eradicating alternative narratives that might destabilize authority. Entire libraries were burned. Catholic texts vanished in flames. Templar secrets disappeared into the void after torture and execution. The Church understood the danger of memory. If truth could not be killed, it had to be hidden. This pattern of suppression makes the possibility of hidden evidence in the Vatican more plausible, for silence has always been Rome's weapon. And yet, there is an irony here. Each attempt to conceal only adds power to the suspicion, making the hidden story stronger precisely because it is forbidden. Modernity, however, has shifted the balance. Technology, archaeology, and the spread of information have made it harder than ever to maintain silence. Small leaks and accidental discoveries ripple outwards faster than authorities can contain them. In recent decades, declassified Vatican documents have revealed scandals long concealed: financial corruption, political deals, even cover-ups of atrocities. Each revelation chips away at trust, raising the question: if the Church concealed these matters for decades, what else lies buried in those miles of archives? Skeptics may dismiss the bloodline as fantasy, but believers argue that the Church's proven pattern of suppression makes the most explosive secret of all not just possible, but likely. Some researchers point to curious signs that the guardians of the bloodline may not have entirely remained passive. Throughout history, cryptic symbols have surfaced in cathedrals, paintings, and manuscripts that hint at secrets lying just beneath the surface. Leonardo da Vinci, often named as a Grand Master of the Priory of Sion, is said to have embedded clues in his works. Subtle gestures, coded arrangements, symbolic juxtapositions that suggest a hidden reverence for Magdalene and her descendants. Whether this is interpretation or intent, the imagery is undeniable. Magdalene placed beside Christ in the Last Supper where John should be, her figure forming a mirrored V shape, the ancient symbol of the womb. To the casual viewer, it is art. To the initiated, it is revelation hiding in plain sight. Such symbols may have been the way the bloodline revealed itself in defiance of suppression, speaking silently to those with eyes to see. Equally intriguing are the architectural anomalies of certain churches, particularly in southern France. Rennes-le-Château remains the most famous, with its bizarre inscriptions, cryptic artwork, and unexplained wealth of its priest, Berenger Saunière. Scholars and seekers alike have long debated whether Saunière stumbled upon proof of the bloodline, documents, treasures, or even relics that forced the Church into complicity, providing him with funds in exchange for silence. His sudden prosperity, his eccentric renovations, and his secrecy about the source of his fortune only fuel the theory. Why would the Church, normally swift to punish wayward priests, allow Saunier to flourish unchecked? Unless, of course, he had leverage so powerful that even Rome dared not act against him. The deeper one follows these trails, the more it begins to seem as though the bloodline has always existed in a paradoxical state, simultaneously hidden and revealed. Suppressed at the official level, it nevertheless leaves traces, subtle, fragmentary, symbolic, that act like breadcrumbs across history. The Vatican may hold the keys in its vaults, but perhaps the truth was never meant to be locked away entirely. Perhaps the guardians of the bloodline ensured that its story would survive through art, architecture, folklore, and coded texts, preserving memory even in the face of systematic erasure. In this sense, the very act of suppression becomes part of the myth, a dark backdrop against which the light of hidden truth continues to flicker. In a modern era, revelations sometimes come not from dusty manuscripts but from sudden cracks in silence. Journalists, researchers, and even whistleblowers have hinted that certain factions within the Vatican know more than they will admit. There are rumors of cardinals who privately acknowledge Magdalene's true role, of internal documents circulating among only the highest echelons. The secrecy is so absolute that even whispers feel dangerous, but the effect is unmistakable, a sense that the institution is not monolithic, that there are those within it torn between loyalty to tradition and the unbearable weight of buried truth. It raises the tantalizing possibility that one day, whether by leak, accident, or divine timing, the archives may yield their secrets, and the forbidden bloodline may emerge from the shadows into undeniable light. The question then becomes, what happens when such a revelation occurs? Would it shatter Christianity, unraveling centuries of doctrine? Or would it renew it, grounding faith in a more human, intimate Christ, one who loved, partnered, and left a living legacy? The possibility is both exhilarating and terrifying. For the faithful who built their lives on the idea of Christ's divine singularity, the shock could be devastating. For those long disillusioned by institutional corruption, it might feel like liberation, the return of a truth too long denied. The Church knows this, and perhaps this is why silence remains their chosen weapon. Better to allow speculation than to risk the storm of certainty. What is clear is that the forbidden bloodline, whether hidden in vaults or preserved in stories, refuses to die. It waits, suspended between myth and history, between rumor and revelation. Every locked door in the Vatican, every unexplained symbol in cathedrals, every silence in papal responses becomes another clue, another thread pulling seekers deeper into the labyrinth. The archives remain sealed, but the imagination has already pried them open in countless ways, weaving visions of genealogies, relics, and suppressed gospels waiting to emerge. Whether one believes in their literal existence or not, the effect is the same: a living mystery, a story too potent to fade, too explosive to reveal. If the trail of the forbidden bloodline has lingered in legend, whispered in secret societies, and concealed within the Vatican's guarded vaults, then Section 15 is where the story reaches its crescendo. For centuries, the idea has hovered on the margins, a dangerous myth too controversial to confront openly, yet too persistent to die. And yet, in the modern world, an age of advanced science, digital leaks, and shifting geopolitics, the possibility of this truth coming into the light feels closer than ever. The climax of a narrative is not in some medieval chamber or Renaissance cathedral, but in our own time, where the clash between secrecy and revelation grows sharper with each passing decade. What would happen if the bloodline of Christ were revealed today? What forces would rise to protect it, and which would try to bury it forever? To understand the gravity of such a revelation, one must first grasp the fragile balance of power that rests upon centuries of tradition. The authority of the Catholic Church, and by extension, the structure of Christian belief across much of the globe, rests on a single premise: that Christ was divine, set apart, and unattached in the earthly sense. His death and resurrection, untethered by family or legacy, was presented as the ultimate act of divine sacrifice. But if Christ had a bloodline, if he married and fathered children, then the Church's foundation would tremble. Suddenly, the authority of priests, popes, and councils would be overshadowed by something more visceral. A living lineage, descendants who could claim not just spiritual inheritance, but biological connection to divinity itself. Such a truth could fracture denominations, ignite new sects, and destabilize centuries of theological dominance. Some argue that this is precisely why the secret has been guarded so fiercely. But others suggest that the revelation of the bloodline could, paradoxically, unite rather than divide. Imagine a world weary of religious wars, political corruption, and spiritual emptiness suddenly confronted with tangible proof that Christ's legacy was not abstract, but embodied in flesh and blood. Would this humanize faith, bringing people closer to the figure of Jesus as husband, father, and partner, rather than a distant deity? Or would it unleash chaos, with competing factions clamoring to follow or exploit the living heirs of the Nazarene? The possibilities are staggering, both in their promise and their peril. In recent years, speculative connections between the bloodline and modern aristocracy have only fueled the fire. Some researchers trace the Merovingian dynasty of France back to alleged unions of Magdalene and Jesus, suggesting that royal families of Europe may carry divine blood. If true, this would mean that the very concept of divine right of kings was not mere propaganda, but rooted in a deeper claim, that rulers descended from the sacred union itself. Even if only partially true, this theory entwines religion with geopolitics in ways almost impossible to unravel. The Vatican, monarchies, and even secular governments would have vested interests in either proving or discrediting such links, for the stakes reach beyond faith into the realm of power, inheritance, and legitimacy. Adding another layer is the role of modern science. In an era when DNA testing can uncover paternity disputes with absolute certainty, the thought of testing ancient relics or preserved remains raises questions the Church cannot comfortably answer. What if bones claimed to be those of Magdalene or even Jesus himself were tested, and lineages could be traced through living descendants? There are whispers that this has already been attempted in secret, that samples were quietly analyzed and results buried. Whether this is true or not, the fact that it is conceivable today forces us to ask, are we living in the age when the forbidden bloodline may finally be confirmed by science? And if that moment arrives, who will control the narrative? The Church, the scientists, or the people? But perhaps the climax lies not only in potential revelation, but in the struggle to suppress it. For every seeker who believes the truth is close at hand, there are forces equally determined to ensure it never sees the light. These forces may not be limited to the Vatican alone. Secular powers, intelligence agencies, and corporations have long recognized that control over belief translates into control over populations. A revelation as explosive as the bloodline could destabilize entire regions, shift alliances, and rewrite history itself. It is not difficult to imagine clandestine groups, modern heirs of the Inquisition, working tirelessly to intercept researchers, discredit whistleblowers, and flood the public sphere with disinformation. In such a battle, the truth becomes both weapon and target, fought over in the shadows as if it were a relic of unimaginable power. And here lies the heart of the climax, the realization that the bloodline, whether literal or symbolic, has always been more than history. It is a mirror reflecting humanity's deepest struggles: faith versus reason, power versus truth, myth versus evidence. To believe in it is to challenge centuries of authority, to risk ridicule, and yet also to glimpse a more intimate Christ, a Christ who is not an untouchable figure on a cross, but a man who loved, who partnered, who left a living trace in the world. To deny it is to protect orthodoxy, but the cost of silencing stories, symbols, and whispers that refuse to die. This tension, unresolved for 2,000 years, now reaches its sharpest edge in our time. Some propose that the bloodline itself may be preparing for revelation, that the heirs, if they exist, have always known their heritage and are waiting for the right moment to emerge. This idea, almost cinematic in its scope, envisions a lineage that is hidden in plain sight, moving through noble families, secret societies, and circles of influence, waiting for the moment when humanity is ready to know. Could it be that the Priory of Sion, the Templars, and countless guardians of the Grail were not preserving a treasure, but protecting living descendants? And if so, might the climax of their mission draw near, as humanity faces crises of meaning, faith, and survival that cry out for a story powerful enough to reset the axis of history? The potential revelation of the bloodline would not occur in isolation. It would intersect with broader shifts, the decline of institutional religion, the rise of esotericism, the hunger for spiritual authenticity in a disenchanted world. Conspiracy theorists, mystics, and seekers alike argue that the bloodline represents the ultimate suppressed knowledge, the union of sacred and human, the feminine and masculine, the divine and earthly, in a world fractured by division. Such a story could act as a catalyst for renewal or for conflict. And that is why, in the climactic moment of this narrative, the stakes feel impossibly high. The truth could liberate humanity, or it could plunge it into chaos. The choice may not rest with the church or the descendants, but with us, with how we respond when forbidden history finally knocks on the door of the present. As the tension builds toward its breaking point, one cannot help but feel the presence of a paradox. The bloodline is both hidden and revealed, both myth and possibility, both dismissed and obsessively pursued. Its power lies not only in whether it exists, but in the fact that it cannot be entirely silenced. For every sealed archive, there is a whisper. For every denial, a symbol carved in stone. For every attempt at erasure, a new seeker rises, determined to follow the trail. And so, the climax is not a single revelation, but the recognition that the bloodline has already achieved immortality in the human imagination. Whether or not the world ever sees living proof, the story itself has become the forbidden treasure, one that continues to shape culture, art, and faith in ways impossible to control. Here, at the edge of revelation, the viewer is left suspended between worlds. The secure, official narrative upheld by centuries of doctrine, and the tantalizing possibility that beneath it lies a far more human, more dangerous, more electrifying truth. The forbidden bloodline is the key that could unlock that door, and in doing so, force humanity to confront not only who Christ was, but who we are, and who we might yet become when myth and history finally collide. As the journey comes to its end, we find ourselves standing not at a doorway, flung wide open, but before a threshold still veiled in shadow. The story of the forbidden bloodline is not a puzzle neatly solved, but a tapestry woven of hints, symbols, silences, and contradictions. Each thread we have followed, ancient texts buried in the desert, whispers of secret societies, cryptic art, sealed Vatican vaults, and the mysteries of southern France, has pointed toward the same possibility, that the history we were taught is only half the story. And yet, for all the fragments and signs, certainty remains just out of reach. This, perhaps, is the greatest power of the bloodline. It cannot be erased, yet refuses to be fully revealed. It lingers, eternal, in the space between belief and doubt. In that ambiguity lies a strange kind of immortality. The Church, by suppressing what it could not control, may have inadvertently preserved the story in a form stronger than dogma. A truth locked in the Vatican's vaults can be denied or forgotten, but a mystery, whispered, hunted, never silenced, cannot be killed. It grows in the imagination, carried by artists, mystics, and seekers across centuries. From Leonardo's brush to Saunier's hidden inscriptions, from Cathar chants to modern conspiracy forums, the bloodline lives not just in genealogy, but in myth, not merely in blood, but in the human hunger for forbidden knowledge. Every time someone asks, what if? The lineage of the story itself continues. And perhaps that is the point. Whether the bloodline is literal, flowing through the veins of hidden heirs, or symbolic, embodying the union of the sacred feminine and masculine suppressed by patriarchy, it represents a deeper truth, that history is not as simple as it seems. We are trained to accept the official version, the polished narrative endorsed by power, but beneath the surface lies a darker, messier, and more human story. Jesus not as the untouchable icon of stained glass, but as a man who loved and partnered, whose legacy was not just spiritual, but living, human, carried on in children and in the resilience of memory. Mary Magdalene not as a penitent prostitute, but as equal teacher and bearer of continuity. This reinterpretation may not sit comfortably within the pews, but it resonates with something primal, the longing to connect the divine to the human in a way that feels whole, complete, and real. As we step back from the historical details and scholarly debates, the story reveals its larger shape. It is the story of suppression and survival, of knowledge crushed and reborn, of whispers that outlast decrees. The forbidden bloodline mirrors our own struggles, to preserve what matters when power seeks to erase it, to carry memory across centuries of silence, to keep alive the possibility that the past was richer and stranger than the official record admits. And in this sense, whether the bloodline exists in flesh or only in myth, it serves the same function. It reminds us that truth is not always found in libraries or archives, but in persistence, in a refusal of a story to die, no matter how many times it is burned or buried. But as with all powerful stories, the question remains, what does it mean for us now? In a world fractured by division, disillusioned by institutions, and hungry for meaning, the possibility of a forbidden bloodline strikes a deep chord. To some, it suggests that faith has always been manipulated, that truth has always been censored to serve power. To others, it offers hope, that the sacred was not abstract, unreachable, but lived in the messy, human experience of love, partnership, and legacy. And to still others, it is a call to seek, to dig, to question, not only history but the narratives that shape our present. For if this story was hidden, what else has been kept from us? The bloodline becomes a mirror of the present moment. We live in an age of leaks and revelations, where secrets thought unbreakable are exposed in seconds, where truth and disinformation swirl together in an endless tide. In this context, the forbidden bloodline is more than ancient speculation. It is a metaphor for the struggle of truth itself. The vaults of the Vatican are no longer just physical archives, but symbols of every silence imposed by power, every story denied, every voice erased. And in that light, the enduring survival of the bloodline myth is a reminder that no silence lasts forever. There is, too, a haunting beauty in the possibility that the bloodline may never be proven or disproven. Certainty can end a mystery, but ambiguity keeps it alive. In the unresolved tension, the story becomes participatory, drawing us in not as passive listeners but as seekers. Each of us becomes part of the chain of transmission, carrying the question forward, whispering it into the future. Perhaps that is why the guardians of the bloodline, if they exist, have never revealed themselves fully. For in mystery lies endurance, and in uncertainty lies power. And so we are left with lingering questions. If the descendants of Christ live among us, do they know who they are? Do they walk in silence, aware of their heritage but bound by secrecy? Or are they scattered, unaware that their blood carries a story that could shake the world? Would revelation liberate us or destroy us? Could humanity bear the weight of a divine lineage proven in flesh? Or is the power of the bloodline not in its factual reality, but in its ability to challenge, to provoke, to inspire? These questions hang in the air, unanswered, perhaps unanswerable, but alive. As the screen fades, we are reminded of the power of hidden history. The story of the forbidden bloodline may never appear in textbooks or sermons, but it survives where it matters most: in imagination, in curiosity, in the restless human desire to know what has been denied. That desire is itself a kind of inheritance, a lineage of seekers who refuse to accept silence. In that sense, we too are heirs, not of blood, but the forbidden story, passed down across centuries, still alive, still dangerous, still unresolved. And perhaps that is the most fitting conclusion. For in the end, the forbidden bloodline is not just about Christ or Magdalene, not just about kings or vaults or secrets. It is about us. It is about the stories we choose to preserve, the truths we dare to seek, the silences we refuse to accept. Whether fact or myth, history or legend, the bloodline continues, not only in archives or cathedrals, but in the human heart, where the hunger for forbidden truth burns brighter than ever. The story closes where it began, with a silence. But now it is not the silence of suppression, but the silence of a question left open, waiting for each of us to answer in our own way. What if the forbidden bloodline exists? What if the Church could not erase it? And what if, even now, its truth waits just beyond the veil of history, daring us to step closer, daring us to listen? As the echoes of this long journey fade, one last thought lingers, like a shadow cast across the centuries. We have spoken of archives, of relics, of whispers, and of bloodlines. We have traced the story through dusty cathedrals, hidden vaults, and coded manuscripts. We have felt the weight of suppression and the spark of revelation. Yet in the end, the forbidden bloodline does not belong only to the past. It belongs to the present, and perhaps even more, to the future. For as long as humanity seeks meaning, as long as we question the narratives handed down to us, the bloodline will remain alive, not only in veins, but in the imagination of those who dare to ask what lies beyond the surface. In the silence that follows, we are left to confront ourselves. What does it mean if Jesus truly left a lineage? What does it mean if Mary Magdalene was not erased, but remembered in secret, her presence hidden like a seed beneath the soil, waiting for the right season to rise? Does it mean that faith has been built upon a carefully crafted half-truth, a myth sculpted to consolidate power? Or does it mean that faith itself has always been larger, more complex, more human than we dare to admit? The answer, perhaps, is both and neither. For faith is not undone by mystery, it is strengthened by it. The forbidden bloodline, whether real or myth, forces us to look deeper, to imagine a Christ who is not a figure on a pedestal, but a man woven into the living fabric of humanity. There is something profoundly unsettling and profoundly beautiful in that vision. For centuries, we have been told that divinity is something distant, unreachable, far above our flawed and mortal world. But if the bloodline exists, then divinity walked among us not in isolation, but in intimacy. God not as an untouchable king, but as a father, a partner, a husband. Mary not as a footnote, but as equal, as vessel, as continuation. Such a vision restores something lost, the sacred feminine, long erased, and the idea that holiness can be found not only in sacrifice, but in love, in union, in legacy. And so the bloodline becomes not only a question of history, but of identity. It forces us to ask who we are and what stories we carry in our blood, our memories, our myths. Every culture, every religion, every people has its forbidden stories, the tales that power seeks to silence, yet which refuse to die. They live in folklore, in secret rituals, in the margins of texts, in the symbols carved into stone. The forbidden bloodline of Christ is one such story, but it is also a reflection of all such stories, of the universal truth that what is hidden cannot remain hidden forever. Perhaps that is the most haunting legacy of all. The bloodline may never be revealed in certainty. We may never see a genealogical tree unrolled, or a vial of blood tested, or a descendant stepping forward with proof beyond denial. But in a sense, it does not matter. For the bloodline has already achieved immortality in another form, in the restless human desire for what lies beyond the veil. That desire has carried the story for 2 millennia. It has survived empires, crusades, inquisitions, and the silence of vaults. It has resurfaced in every age, adapted to every generation, and whispered to every seeker. And so long as that desire remains, the bloodline continues, untouchable by suppression, eternal in mystery. As the camera of the mind slowly pulls back, away from manuscripts and cathedrals, away from France and Rome, away from the earthbound search, the perspective shifts. We see humanity itself standing at the crossroads. On one side, the secure path of tradition and official history, where questions are answered and mysteries sealed. On the other side, the dangerous, exhilarating path of forbidden truths, where answers are never complete and every revelation only leads to more questions. The bloodline beckons from that second path, not as a destination, but as a guide, leading us deeper into the labyrinth of history, faith, and myth. What then are we to do with this story? Perhaps we are not meant to solve it, but to carry it. Perhaps the value of the bloodline lies not in its proof, but in its provocation, in its ability to challenge us, unsettle us, and draw us into wonder. To remind us that history is never complete, that truth is never as simple as we are told, that there are always silences waiting to be broken. In this sense, the bloodline becomes an inheritance not of flesh, but of spirit. It is passed down not through DNA, but through curiosity. And if that is so, then we too are its descendants, not by blood, but by the refusal to let the forbidden story die. And so, as this long night's journey into forbidden history draws to a close, we return once more to the silence. But now the silence feels different. It is not the silence of suppression, but the silence before revelation, the pause before a truth too great to name. Somewhere, perhaps, deep beneath Rome, relics sleep in darkness, waiting for light. Somewhere, perhaps, in a forgotten valley of France, symbols carved into stone still whisper their secrets. Somewhere, perhaps, in the veins of an unsuspecting person, the bloodline flows still. Or perhaps, the bloodline has always been here, alive in the story itself, carried forward not by flesh but by imagination. The forbidden bloodline is not erased, is not forgotten. It is here, pulsing in the silence, waiting in the questions, alive in the hunger that drives us to seek. And maybe, just maybe, that is where its true power lies. For as long as it remains, we will keep asking. We will keep searching. And in the search itself, we will find what matters most. Not the certainty of history, but the mystery of truth.